The revolver clicked against the old man's temple, cold steel meeting sun-weathered skin. Four years of hate had led to this moment. 4 years of planning, tracking, waiting. But the aging lawman sitting in the shadowed corner of that godforsaken saloon didn't flinch, didn't beg. His eyes, pale blue and steady as winter ice, just stared back with something worse than fear, understanding. "Son," he whispered, voice like gravel scraping bone, "you picked the wrong table." And in that breath, everything Colt Mercer thought he knew began to crack. "Before we ride into this storm together, I need you to do something for me. Drop a comment below telling me what city you're watching from and what you think about revenge. Does it ever truly satisfy? Hit that like button so I know this story reached you. I want to see how far across this broken world our tale travels. Now, let's find out what happens when a man built on vengeance meets the truth he's been running from. The door to McGreevy's saloon didn't swing open. It exploded inward like a judgment, hinges screaming against wood that had witnessed 20 years of drunken brawls and broken dreams. Dust pirouetted through shafts of late afternoon light, disturbed by boots that hit the warped floorboards with purpose. The kind of purpose that makes men reach for their guns or their prayers, depending on what kind of men they are. Colt Mercer stood in the entrance, a silhouette carved from fury and muscle, backlit by the dying sun of Redemption Hollow. At 26, he'd already collected more ghosts than most men twice his age. His face was all sharp angles and hard living, jaw like a hammer, eyes the color of whiskey that's been left too long in the bottle. Dark stubble couldn't quite hide the scar that ran from his left ear to the corner of his mouth. A souvenir from a knife fight in Abilene that the other man hadn't walked away from. The Colt Peacemaker in his right hand wasn't for show. The walnut grip was worn smooth where his fingers knew every groove, every imperfection. He'd cleaned it that morning, loaded it with 6 fresh rounds that still smelled of powder and promise. 5 would have been enough. Hell, 1 would have been enough. But Colt Mercer didn't believe in taking chances. Not when it came to this. The saloon went silent in the way that only true fear can accomplish. Cards froze mid-deal. Whiskey glasses stopped halfway to trembling lips. Even the piano player, a stick-thin man named Morris who'd survived the war by hiding in a root cellar, let his fingers drift away from the keys, leaving a final note hanging in the stale air like a question nobody wanted to answer. 12 men occupied McGreevy's that afternoon. Colt counted them without moving his head, the way his brother had taught him back when they were just kids playing at being outlaws behind their mama's house in Missouri, before the world went to hell, before everything that mattered turned to ash and memory. Most of the men in that room looked away, smart. They'd heard the stories, everyone had. Young gun with a death wish and the skill to back it up. 3 confirmed kills in Dodge City. 2 more in Santa Fe that the law couldn't quite prove, but everybody knew. Colt Mercer wasn't the fastest draw in the territories, but he was fast enough, and more importantly, he was willing. When a man stops caring whether he lives or dies, when breathing becomes just a habit instead of a desire, that makes him more dangerous than any quick-draw artist who still has something to lose. But one man didn't look away. Elias Boone sat in the back corner exactly where Colt had been told he'd be. The table was positioned strategically, back to the wall, clear view of the entrance, close to the rear exit, but not so close it looked like running was on his mind. The kind of spot a man chooses when he's spent most of his life expecting trouble to walk through the door looking for him. And trouble had finally arrived. Elias was old, not elderly, but old in the way that matters more than years. The kind of old that comes from seeing too much, surviving too much, carrying too much weight on shoulders that should have buckled decades ago. Late 50s, maybe 60, hair the color of dirty snow, cut short but not military. Lines carved deep around eyes that had probably been brown once but now looked faded, like old leather left too long in the sun. His hands rested on the table, still and steady. No gun visible, but Colt knew better than to believe what he could see. The lawman wore a simple dark vest over a gray shirt that had been washed so many times it was more memory than fabric. No badge. Not anymore. That was part of the story too. Colt's boots marked time against the floorboards as he crossed the room, each step deliberate, each step closing the distance between vengeance and whatever came after. He didn't rush, Rushing was for amateurs, for men who hadn't thought it through, hadn't spent 4 years letting hate crystallize into something pure and sharp enough to cut through any last shred of doubt. The other patrons shifted in their chairs, creating space, creating distance. Nobody wanted to catch a stray bullet when the reckoning started. McGreevy himself, a fat man with a face like uncooked dough, had already disappeared behind the bar. Probably had a shotgun back there. Probably wouldn't use it. This wasn't his fight, and in Redemption Hollow, you survived by knowing which fights were yours and which ones belonged to men already halfway to hell. Colt stopped 3 feet from Elias's table, close enough to smell the coffee going cold in the tin cup at the old man's elbow. Close enough to see the slight tremor in Elias's left hand. Not fear, just age, just the body starting to betray the will. "You know who I am," Colt said. Not a question. Elias took a slow breath, let it out even slower. "I know who you think you are." The answer hit wrong. Colt had expected denial, maybe. Defiance, probably. Even fear would have made sense, but this calm, this resignation mixed with something that almost sounded like pity. It scraped against his certainty like rust against metal. "Stand up," Colt said. "Rather not. I'm not asking." Elias's faded eyes met his without blinking. "I know, but I'm still not standing." The peacemaker rose smooth and steady until it pointed directly at Elias's chest. Center, mass. The way you shoot when you mean it. When you're not trying to wound or warn, just end. Colt's finger rested against the trigger. Familiar pressure, familiar weight. He'd practiced this draw 1,000 times, 10,000. Until muscle memory replaced thought, until intention and action became the same thing. "You killed my brother," Colt said, and his voice came out rougher than he intended, scraped raw by years of carrying that sentence around like a stone in his chest. "Daniel Mercer. 4 years ago, outside the bank in Silver Creek, you shot him down like a dog." Something flickered across Elias's face. Not guilt, not fear. Something harder to name. "I remember Daniel," the old lawman said quietly. "I remember that day. I remember every detail." "Good." Colt's thumb pulled back the hammer. The click echoed in the silence like breaking bone. "Then you know why I'm here. Then you know this has been coming." "I do." "Any last words?" Elias shifted slightly in his chair, and every man in the saloon tensed, but he was just settling back, getting comfortable, like they were about to have a conversation instead of a killing. "Just a question," Elias said. "I'm not here for questions. I'm here for blood." "I know, but you've waited 4 years. You can wait 10 more seconds." The old man's eyes held steady, and there was something in them that Colt couldn't quite read, couldn't quite dismiss. "Are you sure you know the truth?" The words landed like a fist to the gut, not because they were loud or aggressive, but because they were quiet and certain, spoken with the kind of confidence that comes from holding cards nobody else can see. "I know what happened," Colt said, but his voice had lost a fraction of its edge, a hairline crack appearing in the foundation he'd built his entire existence on. "I know you murdered my brother." "Do you?" Elias didn't move, didn't gesture, just sat there like a judge waiting for testimony. "Or do you know what someone told you happened?" "There's a difference, son. A big one. Don't call me son." "Fair enough." Elias paused, then said, "Daniel Mercer, 22 years old. Dark hair, green eyes, scar on his right forearm from falling off a horse when he was 12. Good with a rifle, better with a smile. Could talk himself out of damn near anything. Almost talked himself out of that day, too." Colt's breath caught. The details were too specific, too accurate. Anyone could have known Daniel's name, his age. But the scar was from when they were kids, when Daniel had convinced Colt to race horses through the creek bed and taken the fall that should have been Colt's. Nobody knew about that except family. Nobody who wasn't there. "How do you—" "Because I was there," Elias said simply. "Because it happened. Because I've carried that day around the same way you have. Except I was the one who pulled the trigger, which means I've got no choice but to remember every single second. Every word, every decision, every consequence." The gun in Colt's hand felt heavier suddenly, or maybe his arm just felt weaker. 4 years of certainty starting to shift like sand beneath his boots. "You're trying to talk your way out," Colt said, but it sounded hollow even to his own ears. "Am I?" Elias gestured to the gun pointed at his chest. "You think words are going to stop that bullet? You've got the drop on me, son. Mercer. I'm unarmed, sitting down, older than your father if he'd lived long enough. You can pull that trigger anytime you want, and there's not a damn thing I can do about it. So why would I waste my last breath on lies?" The logic was sound. Colt hated that it was sound. "Then tell me," Colt said, and his voice came out barely above a whisper. "Tell me what happened." Elias's weathered face seemed to age another decade in the span of a heartbeat. When he spoke, his voice carried the weight of confession, of burden shared but never relieved. "It was July," Elias began, "third week of the month. Hot enough to fry eggs on rock. I was Marshal of Silver Creek back then. Still had the badge, still believed it meant something. Your brother rode into town around midday with 2 other men. I didn't know their names then. Found out later they called themselves the Brennan brothers, though they weren't brothers at all, just a couple of drifters who'd partnered up for opportunities of the illegal variety." Colt's jaw tightened, but he didn't interrupt. "They tied their horses outside the cattleman's bank," Elias continued, eyes distant now, seeing something beyond the saloon walls, beyond the present moment. Daniel stayed outside. That was his job. Hold the horses, watch for law, make sure they had a clean exit. The Brennans went inside. "He was just holding horses," Colt said. "He wasn't part of it. He was part of it the moment he agreed to be there." Elias's voice hardened slightly, just enough to remind Colt that this old man had been forged in fires that would have broken lesser men. The moment he knew what they were doing and decided to help anyway. Good intentions don't stop bullets, Mercer. They don't bring dead men back to life either. Keep talking. I was 2 streets over when I heard the shots. 3 of them, rapid fire, came from inside the bank. By the time I got there, the Brennans were already running out, bags in hand, guns drawn. And there was Daniel, mounted up and ready, holding their horses exactly where they'd left them. Elias paused, took a shallow breath. "And there was blood on the bank steps," he said quietly. "A man named Thomas Whitaker, 56 years old, worked as a clerk, had a wife named Mary, 2 daughters, Emily and Sarah, and a granddaughter he'd never met because his son died in the war. Thomas Whitaker was walking into the bank to make a deposit when the Brennans were walking out. He startled them, or maybe they were just nervous. Either way, one of them shot him, center chest. He died before I could even reach him." The name meant nothing to Colt. Thomas Whitaker, just another casualty of the territories. Another body that got buried and forgotten while the world kept spinning its violent wheel. But the way Elias said it, the precision, the detail, the weight behind those words, it didn't sound like a lie. It sounded like something memorized because forgetting would be a betrayal. "Daniel didn't shoot him," Colt said. "No, Daniel didn't shoot him." Elias met his eyes again. "But Daniel was there. Daniel saw it happen. And when I came running with my gun drawn and shouted for them to stop, to throw down their weapons, Daniel did what the Brennans were doing. He reached for his gun. Because you were shooting at him." "I wasn't shooting at anyone. Not yet." Elias's voice remained level, factual, the tone of a man recounting events he'd been over 1,000 times in his own head, looking for the moment where it could have gone different, where one choice might have changed everything. "I had my gun out, yes. Man's just been shot dead. 3 armed men are fleeing the scene. Damn right I had my gun out. But I didn't fire. I gave them a chance. I shouted for them to surrender. I told them to drop their weapons and get off their horses. I gave them every opportunity to end it without bloodshed. And the Brennans opened fire." The words came out flat, empty of everything except truth. 2 against 1, me standing in the middle of the street with citizens behind me, people who'd trusted me to keep them safe. I had no choice. I fired back, got one of the Brennans in the shoulder, enough to make him drop his gun. The other one took cover behind his horse, kept shooting. Colt's heart hammered against his ribs. He'd imagined this scene so many times. Daniel, innocent and afraid, gunned down by an overzealous lawman who shot first and asked questions never. But this version, this other possibility, it scraped against everything he'd built his identity on. And Daniel? His voice came out hoarse. Daniel fired 3 shots at me. Elias didn't look away, didn't soften it. First one went wide, nerves probably. Second one hit a post 2 feet to my left. Third one, he touched his side just below his ribs. Third one found its mark. Punched clean through, missed anything vital, but it put me down. I fell behind a water trough. The saloon remained frozen. Not a man breathed loud enough to hear. Even the dust seemed to hang suspended in the air, waiting. I was bleeding, Elias said. Hurting. But I still had my gun, and I still had my responsibility to every person in Silver Creek who'd wake up tomorrow expecting justice for Thomas Whitaker, expecting safety from the men who'd killed him. So when I heard horses moving, when I looked up and saw Daniel raising his gun to fire again, not at me this time, I was down, but at Deputy Harris who'd come running from the jail, I did what I had to do. You shot him. I shot him. No pride in the admission, no shame either. Just the flat acknowledgement of a man who'd made an impossible choice and lived with it ever since. One shot. He fell from his horse. By the time I got to him, he was already gone. Silence. Suffocating and absolute. Colt's hand trembled, just slightly, just enough to notice. You're lying, he said. But the conviction had leaked out of his voice, replaced by something rawer, more desperate. You're lying to save yourself. Why would I lie to a man who's already decided to kill me? Elias asked. What do I gain from it? Another 30 seconds of breathing? If I'm going to die today, and maybe I am, I'd rather die with the truth spoken than live with more lies. Had enough of those to last whatever time I've got left. My mother... Colt's voice cracked. My mother said Daniel was murdered. She said you shot him in cold blood because he was in the wrong place. Your mother lost a son. Elias's expression softened just a fraction. She needed someone to blame. Easier to believe it was murder than to accept that Daniel made choices, bad choices, that got him killed. I don't fault her for that. But her grief doesn't change what happened. The Brennans, where are they? One died of infection from the shoulder wound about a week later, refused a doctor, figured he could tough it out. He figured wrong. Elias shifted in his chair, wincing slightly. The other one got caught 2 months later in New Mexico, hanged for murder and robbery. He confessed to the whole thing before they dropped him, testified in writing that Daniel Mercer was part of the plan from the start, that he'd been riding with them for 3 weeks, that he knew exactly what they were going to do in Silver Creek. No. The word came out broken. No, Daniel wouldn't. He wasn't like that. He wouldn't rob a bank. He wouldn't kill anyone. People aren't just one thing, Elias said quietly. Your brother probably had good in him. Most folks do. But he also made a choice that day. He chose money over right. He chose to hold those horses knowing what his partners were doing inside that bank. And when it went wrong, when Thomas Whitaker died and I came running, he chose to fight instead of surrender. Those choices, not me, not my gun, those choices killed your brother. Colt's vision blurred. Rage or tears or both. He couldn't tell anymore, didn't want to tell. 4 years. 4 years of hate keeping him warm at night, keeping him focused, keeping him alive when living felt like more punishment than dying. 4 years of planning this moment, imagining the satisfaction of watching the light go out of Elias Boone's eyes, knowing that justice, his version of justice, had finally been served. But now everything felt uncertain. The ground beneath his feet that had seemed so solid suddenly felt like it was made of smoke and shadows, liable to disappear the moment he put his full weight on it. How do I know you're telling the truth? Colt asked, and he sounded younger than his years, sounded like the boy he'd been before Daniel died, before revenge became religion. You don't. Elias spread his hands slowly, carefully. That's the hell of it. You can shoot me right now, kill me for what I did, and you'll never know for certain whether I deserved it or whether you just murdered the man who tried to save lives 4 years ago. Or you can walk away, spend the rest of your days wondering if you let your brother's killer go free. Either way, you're stuck with doubt. Either way, you've got to live with what you choose in this room. The peacemaker wavered, just an inch, just enough. There were witnesses, Colt said. People who saw what happened. There were. Some of them still live in Silver Creek. You could find them, ask them. They tell you the same thing I just did, assuming they're willing to talk to a man who looks like he's one breath away from shooting anyone who gives the wrong answer. You could have come forward. You could have found me, told me, and say what? Elias's voice gained a harder edge. Your brother was an outlaw who helped kill an innocent man? That would have gone over real well, I'm sure. You'd have thanked me kindly and moved on with your life. He shook his head. I thought about it. After I heard you were hunting me, after the stories started spreading, I thought about tracking you down, trying to explain. But men like you, men built on grief and fury, they don't want explanations. They want targets. You don't know what I want, don't I? Elias leaned forward slightly, and the movement was slow enough, non-threatening enough, that Colt didn't shoot. You've spent 4 years hunting a ghost, 4 years building me up into some kind of monster so that killing me would feel righteous instead of just murderous. You want me to be the villain so badly you can taste it. Because if I was just a lawman doing my job, if your brother really did fire first, then what does that make all those years? What does that make you? The question hung in the air like gun smoke. Colt's finger tightened on the trigger. A fraction of pressure, that's all it would take. A fraction of pressure and 4 years of commitment would end in thunder and blood, and the kind of finality that couldn't be questioned or reversed. But Elias's eyes, those faded, tired, honest eyes, they didn't look away, didn't plead, just waited with the patience of a man who'd already made peace with whatever came next. Pull it or put it down, Elias said softly, but decide. Every man in this saloon is waiting to see what kind of person you really are. Hell, I think you're waiting too. Colt's breath came faster. His heart slammed against his ribs. The gun felt impossibly heavy, or maybe his soul felt impossibly heavy, and the weight was just transferring through his arm into the cold steel that had seemed like the answer to everything and now seemed like the answer to nothing at all. In that moment, frozen between vengeance and doubt, between the boy he'd been and the man he might become, Colt Mercer realized something that terrified him more than any gunfight ever had. He didn't know what the truth was anymore, and he didn't know if killing Elias Boone would change that. But his finger was still on the trigger, and the choice, for better or worse, was still his to make. The grandfather clock against the saloon's far wall ticked into the silence. Colt heard every second passing like a nail being driven into wood. His arm ached from holding the gun steady, muscle tremors starting to work their way up from his wrist to his shoulder. Sweat traced a line down his temple despite the cooling afternoon air drifting through the broken door. Tell me about Thomas Whitaker, Colt said finally, his voice scraping out rough. The man who died. Tell me about him. Elias blinked, something like surprise flickering across his weathered features. Of all the questions the young gunfighter could have asked, this apparently wasn't one he'd expected. Why does it matter? Because if my brother helped kill him, I need to know who he was. Colt's jaw worked. I need to understand what Daniel threw his life away for. The old lawman studied him for a long moment, then nodded slowly. Thomas was a good man, boring as Sunday church, but good. He'd worked at that bank for 32 years, started as a clerk when he was barely 24, stayed there his whole life. Never stole a cent, never lied on the books, never did anything more exciting than maybe staying up past 9 o'clock on his birthday. Elias's voice took on a quality that spoke of real memory, real grief that time had dulled but never fully erased. He was walking in to deposit money from the general store, the old man continued. Mary, his wife, she ran the place. Still does, last I heard. Thomas always made the deposits himself every Tuesday and Friday, regular as clockwork. You could set your watch by him. A pause. The Brennans didn't even give him a chance to run. He just walked through that door at the wrong moment and caught a bullet because he startled them. Probably didn't even understand what was happening before it was over. How do you know all that? Colt asked. About the deposits, the days, all of it? Because I talked to Mary afterward. Elias's eyes went distant again. Spent about 3 hours sitting in her parlor while she cried and told me every detail of their life together. Every habit, every routine, every small thing that made Thomas who he was. She needed someone to listen, needed someone to understand that he wasn't just a body on the bank steps. He was a husband, a father, a grandfather. He was someone who mattered. The gun in Colt's hand felt heavier with every word. And the granddaughter he never met, he heard himself ask, born 6 months after he died. Sarah, that was his youngest daughter, she was pregnant when it happened. Named the baby Grace Whitaker. Elias met his eyes. She'd be about 3.5 now, growing up without ever knowing the grandfather who would have spoiled her rotten if the stories Mary tells are true. Colt's throat tightened. He didn't want to hear this. Didn't want to think about the ripples spreading out from that day in Silver Creek, the lives altered and broken and forever changed by decisions made in seconds. It was easier when it was just about Daniel, just about revenge, just about the simple mathematics of death requiring death in return. But nothing about this was simple anymore. Did Daniel know? The question came out barely above a whisper. Did he know about Whitaker? Did he see him get shot? I don't know what Daniel saw. Elias shifted in his chair and the movement made him wince. Old wounds or old age, Colt couldn't tell. He was outside holding the horses. Whitaker got shot inside the bank, but Daniel would have heard the gunfire, would have known something went wrong. He could have ridden off right then, left the Brennans to face what they'd done alone. Nobody would have stopped him. Nobody even knew he was part of it yet. But he didn't run. No, he stayed, held those horses steady, waited for his partners to come out so they could all escape together. Elias's voice hardened just slightly. So when you ask if Daniel knew, here's what I can tell you for certain. He knew enough. He knew something had gone bad in that bank. He heard the shots, and he still chose to help the men who fired them get away. Behind the bar, McGreevy made a slight movement, reaching for something. Every gun hand in the saloon tensed, but it was just the barkeep grabbing a rag to wipe his sweating face. The tension was becoming unbearable, a room full of men waiting for violence that kept threatening but never quite arriving. Colt lowered the gun. Not all the way. Just enough that it pointed at Elias's chest instead of his head. The old lawman noticed but didn't react, didn't show relief or fear. He just watched Colt with those patient, knowing eyes that had probably seen every variation of human behavior the territories had to offer. My mother told me you were corrupt, Colt said. That you worked with the bank, that Daniel found out about it, and was going to report you, so you killed him to keep him quiet. Is that what she believed? Something that might have been sadness crossed Elias's face. Or is that what someone told her to make the pain easier to bear? Don't talk about my mother like you know her. I don't know her, but I know grief. Elias leaned back in his chair. I know how it twists things, how it makes us desperate for explanations that let us keep loving the people we lost without having to face what they really were. Your mother needed Daniel to be innocent, needed it so badly she'd believe anything that made it true. I understand that. I just can't pretend it changes the facts. Facts. Colt's laugh came out bitter. Your facts. Your version of what happened. Then find another version. Elias spread his hands. I told you where it happened. I gave you names of witnesses. Silver Creek isn't so far that you couldn't ride there in 3 days. Ask around. Talk to the people who were there. Hell, talk to Mary Whitaker if you've got the stomach for it. She'll tell you the same thing I just did, except she'll do it while looking at you like you're the same kind of trash that killed her husband, because you're here defending the man who helped make her a widow. The words hit like fists. Colt felt his anger flare. The familiar, comfortable heat that had sustained him through 4 years of cold nights and colder certainty. But underneath the anger, something else squirmed, something that felt uncomfortably like shame. Daniel was my brother, he said, and it came out defensive, almost pleading. He did. Elias cut him off, voice sharp now, the patience wearing thin. He did, Mercer. Whatever you want to believe about who Daniel was before that day, whatever good memories you're carrying around like armor against the truth, none of it changes what he chose to do in Silver Creek. He rode with outlaws. He helped them rob a bank. He was there when an innocent man got killed. And when the law came, he drew his weapon and fired at lawmen who were just trying to do their jobs. He was scared. He panicked. Probably. Elias nodded. Probably he was terrified. Probably he was in over his head and didn't know how to get out. But being scared doesn't excuse what he did. It doesn't bring Thomas Whitaker back. It doesn't give Mary those 32 years she should have had with her husband. It doesn't give little Grace a grandfather. Colt's hand trembled. The gun wavered. You want me to be the villain so badly? Elias continued, his voice dropping lower, more intense. You need me to be the monster because if I'm not, then your brother was. And that's too hard to accept, isn't it? Easier to spend 4 years hunting a lawman than to face the possibility that Daniel made his own choices and paid his own price for them. Stop. The word came out strangled. Why? Because the truth hurts? Elias didn't stop, didn't give ground. Because it's destroying the story you've been telling yourself? Good. Maybe it needs to be destroyed. Maybe you need to hear it straight instead of filtered through grief and lies and whatever poison someone fed your mother to keep her from having to face reality. I said stop! Colt's voice cracked across the saloon like a whip. His finger tightened on the trigger, just a fraction, just enough to feel the resistance, the promise of violence waiting on the other side of that pressure. Elias went silent, but he didn't look away, didn't flinch, just sat there like a man who'd already made peace with whatever came next, who'd spent 4 years waiting for this moment and was almost relieved it had finally arrived. The clock ticked. Someone near the door coughed nervously. Morris, the piano player, had disappeared entirely, probably slipped out the back when nobody was paying attention. Smart man. You said you gave them a chance to surrender, Colt said, after a long moment, his voice steadier now but hollow, scraped clean of anything resembling certainty. You said you shouted for them to throw down their weapons. I did. How many times? The question seemed to catch Elias off guard. What? How many times did you tell them to surrender? Once? Twice? How long did you give them before you started shooting? Elias's jaw worked. 3 times. I shouted 3 times for them to drop their weapons and dismount. The Brennans opened fire on the second warning. Daniel... He paused. Daniel waited until the 3rd. Almost thought he might actually do it, might actually put the gun down. But then Harris came running up from the jail, and Daniel swung toward him, and I didn't have a choice anymore. Deputy Harris, Colt repeated. Where's he now? Dead. Got killed about 2 years ago trying to break up a knife fight outside a brothel in Tucson. Caught a blade in the throat. Bled out before anyone could help him. Elias's expression didn't change. If you're thinking he could have backed up my story, you're too late. But there were others. Shopkeeper named Chen, who watched the whole thing from his store across the street. Woman named Ruth Peterson, who was walking past when it started. A drifter whose name I never caught, but who stuck around long enough to give a statement before moving on. Convenient that the deputy's dead. Convenient for who? Elias shot back. I'm the one sitting here with a gun pointed at my chest. I'm the one who's been waiting 4 years for you to show up looking for blood. Harris being alive or dead doesn't change my situation. Doesn't change what happened that day. Colt wanted to argue, wanted to find some crack in the story he could wedge his certainty into and pry the whole thing apart. But the details were too specific, too consistent, too devoid of the kind of self-serving additions that usually marked a lie. Elias wasn't trying to make himself look like a hero, wasn't claiming he'd given Daniel every possible chance or that he'd agonized over the decision. He was just recounting events the way they'd happened, without embellishment or apology. It had the ring of truth, and that terrified Colt more than any gunfight ever had. Tell me about afterward, he said, after you shot Daniel. What happened then? Elias took a slow breath. The Brennan who wasn't hit ran. Got on his horse and rode out while I was bleeding behind that water trough. Took us 2 months to track him down. The one I'd wounded. He tried to run too, but his horse threw him. We got him in a cell, got a doctor to patch up his shoulder. He died a week later, like I said. Infection set in fast. And Daniel? Daniel was already gone by the time I reached him. Something in Elias's voice softened, just a fraction. I checked anyway. Felt for a pulse, listened for breathing, nothing. The shot had caught him just below his rib cage, angled up, probably hit his heart or something close to it. He wouldn't have suffered long. Colt's vision blurred. He blinked hard, refusing to let the tears fall. Not here. Not in front of this man in this room full of strangers who were watching him like he was a show put on for their entertainment. What did you do with him? The words came out rough, forced through a throat gone tight. We took him to the undertaker. Had him cleaned up, dressed proper. I paid for it myself, figured it was the least I could do. Elias's eyes held steady on Colt's. We buried him in the Silver Creek Cemetery 3 days later. Small service. Just me, Harris, the undertaker, and the preacher. We didn't know where to send word about his death. Daniel didn't have any identification on him except his name. No letters, no addresses. It wasn't until about 2 weeks later that we found out he had family in Missouri. By then you'd already come for the body. My uncle came. Colt said quietly. My mother's brother. He brought Daniel home. I remember him, Elias nodded. Angry man. Didn't want to hear anything about what happened. Just wanted to collect Daniel and leave. Can't say I blamed him. He told my mother you murdered Daniel in cold blood, that you shot him down without warning because he'd discovered you were stealing from the bank. Your uncle believed what he needed to believe. Same as your mother. Same as you. Elias's voice carried no accusation, just statement of fact. People believe what makes sense to them, what fits the story they need to tell themselves. The truth is messy. It's complicated. It requires accepting that the people we love aren't always who we think they are. Colt's arm was really shaking now, fatigue setting in, adrenaline starting to ebb and leave behind something closer to exhaustion. He'd been running on rage and purpose for so long that without them, he felt hollow, empty, like a gun with all the bullets fired and nothing left but the weight of the metal. I don't know what to believe anymore, he admitted, and the confession felt like defeat. Then don't believe anything yet. Elias leaned forward slightly. Go to Silver Creek. Ask around. Find the truth for yourself instead of taking my word for it, or your uncle's word, or anyone else's. You've spent 4 years preparing to kill me. You can spare a few more days making sure you're killing the right man for the right reasons. And if I find out you're lying, if I find proof you murdered my brother, then you come back here and finish what you started today. Elias's expression didn't waver. I'll be here. I'm not going anywhere. Been in Redemption Hollow for 3 years now, and I don't have any plans to leave. You want your shot at me? You'll get it. Just make sure it's based on truth instead of stories. The offer hung in the air between them. Reasonable, logical, the kind of thing a man with nothing to hide would suggest. But Colt had spent 4 years imagining this confrontation, 4 years building toward this moment of righteous violence, and the idea of walking away without resolution felt like surrendering something fundamental to who he'd become. Why'd you leave Silver Creek? He asked, changing direction. If you were such a good lawman, why'd you give up the badge? Something dark crossed Elias's face. Pain, maybe, or regret that went deeper than anything they'd discussed so far. Because I killed a 22-year-old kid, he said quietly. Because even though it was the right decision, even though I'd make the same choice again if I had to, it still meant I'd ended a life. And that takes something from you, changes you, makes you look at the badge differently, at the job differently, at yourself differently. He paused, then continued. I stayed on for about 6 months after that day, kept doing the job, kept enforcing the law, kept telling myself it was worth it. But every time I walked past that bank, every time I saw Mary Whitaker in the general store, every time I had to draw my weapon, I saw Daniel Mercer falling from his horse, saw the blood, saw the moment when his eyes went from afraid to empty. You don't come back from that unchanged, Mercer. You just don't. So you ran away. I resigned. Elias's voice hardened. There's a difference. I stayed until they could find a replacement. I made sure the town was covered. Then I turned in my badge and left. Figured I'd done enough damage to Silver Creek. Figured they deserved better than a marshal who jumped every time a door slammed too hard. And you came here. Eventually, drifted for a while first. Did some work as a ranch hand, some security for mining operations. Nothing that required a gun if I could help it. Ended up in Redemption Hollow about 3 years back and decided it was as good a place as any to wait out whatever time I've got left. Colt processed this, turning it over in his mind. The story was coherent. It fit together without obvious contradictions. But it was also exactly the kind of story a guilty man might construct to justify his actions, to cast himself as the tragic hero instead of the villain. You said you shot Daniel once, Colt said. 1 shot. That's right. Where did you aim? Elias's eyes narrowed slightly. Center mass, same place you're currently pointing that peacemaker. I aimed for his chest because I was trying to stop him, not wound him. When you're in a gunfight, you don't shoot to disable. You shoot to end the threat before the threat ends you. Professional. Practical. Elias didn't flinch from the implied accusation. I've seen men try to wing their opponents, try to be gentle about it. Most of them ended up dead because they hesitated, or because their shot didn't stop the other man from returning fire. I wasn't trying to kill your brother, Mercer. I was trying to survive. There's a difference, even if the result is the same. The clock chimed. 4:30. The sun would be getting lower now, shadows stretching across Redemption Hollow's dirt streets. In another hour, it would be dusk. In 2, full dark. Time kept moving, whether Colt made a decision or not. A thought occurred to him, something he should have asked at the beginning, but had been too consumed with rage to consider. "Why are you here alone?" he asked. "You had to know I was coming. You had to know what I wanted. Why didn't you get back up? Why didn't you have friends here, guns ready, an ambush waiting?" Elias actually smiled at that, a small, sad expression that didn't reach his eyes. "Because that would have meant more killing," he said simply. "You want me dead? Fine. That's between you and me. But I wasn't going to let you start a war that would get other people hurt just because you're angry about something that happened 4 years ago. Whatever happens in this saloon today, it ends here. One way or another. Noble." "Tired," Elias corrected. "I'm tired of killing, tired of blood, tired of carrying bodies to undertakers and explaining to families why their sons or husbands or fathers aren't coming home. If you're going to shoot me, then shoot me. But I'm not taking anyone else down with me just to buy myself a few more years of breathing." The honesty of it struck Colt harder than any bullet could have. This wasn't the response of a corrupt lawman trying to save his own skin. This was the response of a man who'd been broken by the weight of the badge he'd worn, who'd made impossible choices and paid for them in sleepless nights and haunted memories. Just like Colt had been broken by Daniel's death. Just like both of them had been carrying ghosts for 4 years. The realization hit like cold water. They weren't different, he and this old lawman. They were the same. 2 men destroyed by a single day in Silver Creek, both trying to find meaning in the violence, both looking for someone to blame so the pain would make sense. Colt's hand began to lower, slowly, incrementally, the gun dropping from Elias's chest to point at the floor between them. "I don't know what to do," Colt said, and his voice cracked on the admission. 26 years old, and he sounded like a lost child. "Yes, you do." Elias's voice gentled. "You know exactly what to do. You're just scared to do it because it means admitting you spent 4 years chasing the wrong thing. That's hard. That hurts worse than any physical wound, but it's the only way forward. What if you're lying? What if I walk away and find out later you did murder him? Then you'll live with that. Same way you'll live with it if you kill me now and find out I was telling the truth." Elias held his gaze. "There's no perfect choice here, son. No option that doesn't leave you with regrets. You just have to decide which regrets you can live with and which ones will destroy you." The saloon door creaked, both men tensed, but it was just a tumbleweed blown against the broken frame, pushed by the evening wind starting to pick up outside. Nobody else had entered. Nobody else was fool enough to interrupt what was happening in McGreevy's. Colt holstered his gun. The movement was so sudden, so unexpected, that half the room flinched, but the peacemaker slid into its leather home with a finality that felt like surrender and release all at once. Elias let out a breath he'd probably been holding since Colt first walked through that door. "Smart choice," the old lawman said. "Don't know about smart." Colt's hands were shaking now that they were empty, trembling with the aftermath of adrenaline and confrontation. "Just the only one I can make right now without throwing up. That's as good a reason as any." They sat in silence for a moment. The rest of the saloon remained frozen, uncertain whether the storm had passed or was just gathering strength. Finally, McGreevy rose from behind the bar, face pale but voice steady. "Anyone need a drink?" the barkeep asked. "Feel like we could all use one." A few nervous laughs rippled through the room. The tension began to ease, men shifting in their chairs, reaching for cards they'd dropped, picking up conversations that had been interrupted by violence that never quite arrived. But Colt and Elias remained locked in their small pocket of the world, 2 men who'd come within a heartbeat of killing each other, now trying to figure out what came next. "What now?" Colt asked. Elias considered the question. "Now you ride to Silver Creek like I said. Ask your questions, find your answers, and then you decide what kind of man you want to be for the rest of your life. And you?" "I'll be here, waiting, same as I've been doing for 3 years. The old lawman's expression held something that might have been hope. "Maybe when you come back, if you come back, we can have a different conversation than the one we almost had today." Colt nodded slowly. He stood up, legs unsteady, feeling like he'd just fought a battle, even though no shots had been fired. The weight of the peacemaker on his hip felt different now, heavier, more like a burden than a promise. He turned to leave, made it 3 steps before Elias's voice stopped him. "Mercer." He looked back. "Your brother," Elias said quietly. "Whatever else he was, whatever mistakes he made, he was still your brother. Don't let what you find out destroy the good memories you've got. Those are worth keeping, even if the truth is ugly." Colt swallowed hard against the lump in his throat. He didn't trust himself to respond, so he just nodded and walked toward the door. But before he reached it, the sound of hoofbeats thundered outside. Multiple riders, moving fast, approaching with the kind of urgency that usually meant trouble. The saloon went still again, all the briefly relaxed tension snapping back tight. Colt's hand dropped to his gun out of instinct. Elias stood from his chair, face grim, eyes fixed on the door. A man burst through, young, covered in dust, eyes wild with fear. "Raiders!" he gasped, nearly falling as he caught himself on the door frame. "The Morrison gang. They're hitting the cattle ranches on the North Road, already burned out the Peterson place. They're coming this way." The saloon erupted, men shouting, chairs scraping, guns being checked. McGreevy started pulling shutters closed. Morris, who'd apparently snuck back in during the confrontation, ran for the back exit again. Colt and Elias looked at each other across the chaos. The old lawman smiled grimly. "Looks like we're not done yet after all." The gun didn't waver. Colt's arm had gone past trembling into something harder, something locked, muscle and bone turned to iron by sheer force of will. But inside, where no one could see, everything was collapsing. 4 years of certainty crumbling like a riverbank in flood season, and he was standing right on the edge, wondering if the ground beneath him had ever been solid at all. "Say something," Colt whispered. His throat felt raw, like he'd been screaming, though he hadn't made a sound louder than conversation this whole time. "Say something that proves you're lying." Elias remained still as carved stone. "Can't prove a negative, son. Can't prove I didn't do something that never happened. That's not how truth works. Stop calling me that." But the words came out hollow, automatic. Like he was reading lines from a script he'd memorized so long ago, he'd forgotten what they meant. "What should I call you then?" Elias asked, and there was something almost gentle in his voice, the tone a man might use with a spooked horse or a wounded animal. "Mercer? Colt? The young man who's about to make the biggest mistake of his life? You don't know what I'm going to do. Neither do you." Elias's eyes never left his face. "That's what's eating at you right now. You came in here knowing exactly how this was going to end. You had it all planned out. 4 years is a long time to rehearse a killing. But now the script's changed and you're standing there realizing you never actually decided what kind of man you wanted to be. You just decided what kind of man your anger told you to be. There's a difference." Colt's jaw clenched so hard his teeth ached. "You think you know me? I know that look in your eyes. I've seen it in mirrors for more years than you've been alive." Elias shifted slightly, and the movement made Colt's finger tighten on the trigger reflexively before forcing himself to ease off. The old lawman noticed but didn't comment. The look of a man who's built his whole existence on one belief, one mission, and suddenly that foundation's cracking. It's terrifying, I know. I've been there. "When?" Elias was quiet for a moment. Somewhere in the saloon, someone's boot scraped against the floor, nervous energy bleeding out in the only movement anyone dared make. McGreevy was still behind the bar. Morris, the piano player, had his hands flat on his knees, staring at nothing. The card players held their positions like they'd been frozen mid-game by some cruel magician's trick. 23 years ago, Elias finally said, I was hunting a man named Carter Donnelly. He'd killed my partner, shot him in the back during a prisoner transport. I spent 2 years tracking Donnelly across 3 territories. 2 years thinking about nothing but putting a bullet in him. Found him in a mining camp outside Denver. Had him dead to rights, gun to his head, exactly like you've got me now. Colt didn't want to ask, but the question came anyway. What happened? He told me the truth. Elias's voice went distant, remembering. Said my partner had been taking bribes from the prisoner we were transporting. Said they'd worked out a deal. The prisoner would escape, my partner would get paid, everyone walks away clean. Except Donnelly was also working for the same people, and they decided loose ends needed cutting. So he killed my partner not because he was a lawman, but because he was a dirty lawman who'd become a liability. You believed him? Eventually. Took some investigating. Turned out my partner had a bank account with money he couldn't explain. Turned out the prisoner had family with deep pockets and no morals. Turned out everything I thought I knew about a man I'd ridden beside for 5 years was a lie. Elias met Colt's eyes. And I was standing there with a gun on Donnelly, knowing that if I pulled that trigger, I'd be killing the only man who'd told me the truth while I'd been busy building monuments to a lie. So you let him go? Hell no. He'd still killed a man, dirty or not. I brought him in, testified at his trial. He hanged, legal and proper. But I didn't pull that trigger in the mining camp. I made the choice to find out what was real before I did something I couldn't take back. Colt's hand felt slick with sweat against the peacemaker's grip. That's different. Daniel was my brother. Which makes it harder, not easier. Elias's voice softened. I get it. When someone you love dies, you need it to mean something. You need there to be a villain, a clear reason, someone to blame. Random chance, bad luck, wrong place, poor choices. That's too meaningless. That's too honest. So you find a target and you paint it black as midnight and you tell yourself that killing it will balance the scales. But it doesn't. It never does. You're just creating another body, another person's grief, another cycle of the same damned wheel. He was supposed to be better. The words ripped out of Colt before he could stop them, raw and broken. Daniel was supposed to be the good one, the smart one. He was going to make something of himself, get out of this life, maybe even... His voice cracked. He wasn't supposed to die robbing a bank. No, he wasn't, Elias agreed quietly. But he did. And you can shoot me, and you can tell yourself it was justice, but it won't change what your brother chose to do that day. It won't make him innocent. It won't bring him back. The truth of it hit like a fist to the solar plexus. Colt's vision blurred. Rage or grief, probably both. Definitely neither one clean or simple. He'd spent 4 years running from this exact realization, this exact moment where he'd have to face the possibility that Daniel hadn't been murdered, hadn't been a victim, had just been a young man who made catastrophically bad decisions and paid the price that bad decisions sometimes demand. I needed it to be your fault, Colt whispered. I needed someone to blame besides him, besides myself for not being there, for not stopping him, for not being able to save him from himself, Elias finished. That's not a weight you get to carry. People make their own choices. You can love them, you can warn them, you can do everything right, and they can still choose wrong. That's not on you. Then who's it on? On the people who made the choices. On Daniel. On the Brennans. On a world that makes hard men out of desperate boys and calls it survival. Elias paused. And right now it's on you. You're making a choice in this moment. You can pull that trigger and add another body to a pile that's already too high, or you can lower that gun and walk out of here knowing you were strong enough to choose different. Colt's breath came in ragged gasps. His arms shook, not from fatigue, but from the sheer effort of holding up the weight of everything that gun represented. 4 years of purpose. 4 years of direction. 4 years of knowing exactly who he was and what he was meant to do. And now Elias Boone was asking him to let all of that go, to step into an emptiness that felt worse than death, because at least death had an end to it. What do I do? The question came out broken, a plea from somewhere deeper than pride. If I don't kill you, if I just walk away, then what? What do I do with all of this? You live with it, Elias said simply. Same as everyone else who's lost someone. Same as me with your brother and a dozen other men I've killed in the line of duty. You carry it. You let it change you without letting it destroy you. You find something worth living for instead of just someone worth dying to kill. I don't know how. Neither did I. Still don't most days, but you figure it out as you go. Or you don't, and you end up like half the men I've put in the ground, so eaten up by what they lost that they become the very thing that took it from them. Elias's expression hardened slightly. You pull that trigger, you become what you think I am. A killer. And unlike me, you won't even have the law to hide behind. Won't have duty or responsibility or anything except your own hurt feelings to justify it. The words stung because they were true. Colt had told himself this was justice, had dressed it up in righteous language and clear purpose, but strip away all the decoration and what was left? A young man with a gun and a grudge, about to murder an unarmed elder in a crowded saloon because someone had told him it would make the pain stop. It wouldn't. He knew that now. The pain would just change shape, would morph from grief into guilt, from loss into shame. He'd carry Elias Boone's death the same way he'd carried Daniel's. And 20 years from now, he might be sitting in a different saloon explaining to a different young man with a different gun why the cycle had to end somewhere. But knowing that and acting on it, those were different countries, and the border between them was marked by the pressure of his finger on cold steel. "I want to hate you," Colt said, and his voice was barely audible. "I need to hate you." "I know, but hatred's a fire that keeps you warm by burning you alive. Eventually, there's nothing left but ash." Elias leaned back in his chair, and the movement was slow, non-threatening, almost weary. "You think I don't carry your brother with me? You think I sleep easy? I see Daniel Mercer's face every time I close my eyes. I see Thomas Whitaker too, and John Brennan, and every other man who died because I was too slow or too fast or just too human to save them all. That's my burden. Don't make it yours too." Colt's hand trembled. The peacemaker dipped, rose again, dipped once more. His entire body was at war with itself, muscle memory and training screaming to finish what he'd started, something deeper and rawer begging him to stop before he crossed a line that had no return path. "Tell me something," Colt said, his voice rough as gravel. "Tell me something that'll make this easier." "There's nothing easy about it." Elias held his gaze. "You can shoot me and it'll be hard. You can walk away and it'll be hard. The only difference is which version of hard you can live with tomorrow morning. Which version lets you look in a mirror without wanting to put a bullet in your own head 6 months from now." The room felt smaller suddenly, like the walls were closing in. Colt could feel the eyes of every man in the saloon on him, could feel their fear and their judgment and their awful curiosity about which way this was going to go. He could feel the weight of his brother's ghost pressing down on his shoulders, could feel his mother's grief, her desperate need for someone to blame, her voice in his head saying that justice demanded blood. But he could also feel something else, something quieter, but maybe more honest. The knowledge that Daniel had made choices, bad ones, fatal ones, and that maybe, just maybe, the man sitting across from him wasn't a monster, wasn't evil, was just another soul trying to survive in a world that didn't give anyone clean answers or easy outs. "I rode 4 years for this," Colt said, and he sounded lost. 4 years? I gave up everything. I became this. What am I supposed to do with myself if I don't pull this trigger? Anything else?" Elias's voice was steady, certain. "Anything at all except add another grave to a ground that's already too full of them." The moment stretched, seconds that felt like hours. Colt's finger on the trigger, his entire future balanced on a fraction of pressure, on a choice that would define him one way or another for whatever time he had left on this earth. And then, the door exploded open. Colt spun, gun rising on instinct, and the sudden movement saved his life as a bullet cracked through the space where his head had been half a heartbeat before. The shot came from the doorway, from a figure backlit by the dying sun. Another man, younger, wild-eyed, and desperate. "You killed my partner!" The newcomer screamed, and Colt registered details in the split second before things went completely to hell. Maybe 20 years old, filthy trail clothes, a Remington revolver that had seen better days, hands shaking so badly the next shot went wide and shattered a whiskey bottle behind the bar. McGreevy swore and ducked lower. Morris threw himself under the piano. The card players scattered like startled birds. Colt didn't think. 4 years of hunting had honed instincts that bypassed thought entirely. He moved left, fired once, and the kid in the doorway went down with a scream that was more surprise than pain. The bullet had taken him in the thigh. Colt had aimed low on purpose, muscle memory from 1,000 practice draws overriding the kill shot his body knew how to make. But there were more of them. 3 more men came through the door, weapons drawn, faces Colt didn't recognize but attitudes he knew all too well. Outlaws. The kind who rode together and died together and didn't much care who they took with them. "That's Colt Mercer," one of them shouted. Older, scarred, missing part of his ear. "He's the one that killed Jesse in Dodge," Colt swore. Jesse Ketchum. 3 months ago, a saloon in Dodge City, a fight over a card game that had escalated into gunfire. Colt had walked away. Jesse hadn't. Self-defense, clear as day, but apparently Jesse had friends who saw it different. The scarred man fired. Colt dove behind a table, wood splintering as bullets chewed through it. He hit the floor hard, rolled, came up with the peacemaker tracking targets. Fired twice. One of the outlaws went down clutching his shoulder, another ducked behind the doorframe. And then Elias was moving. The old lawman surged up from his chair with speed that belied his years, hand already pulling a Colt Army revolver from somewhere beneath his vest. He fired once, twice, 3 times in rapid succession. The shots were precise, controlled, the mark of a man who'd spent decades learning where to put bullets when lives depended on it. The outlaw behind the doorframe fell. The scarred man took a round in his gun arm and his weapon clattered to the floor. The last one standing, a kid who couldn't have been more than 19, froze, gun half raised, suddenly realizing he was outmatched and outgunned by men who killed for different reasons, but with equal efficiency. "Drop it," Elias said, voice like iron. "Drop it or join your friends." The young outlaw's gun hit the floor. His hands went up. His face had gone white as sun-bleached bone. Silence crashed down like thunder. Gun smoke hung in the air, acrid and familiar. Colt's ears rang from the shots in the enclosed space. His heart hammered against his ribs. The peacemaker was still in his hand, still loaded, still ready, and Elias Boone stood 6 feet away with his own weapon trained on the surviving outlaws, looking more alive and alert than he had since Colt had walked through that door. Their eyes met across the wreckage of the saloon. "Well," Elias said dryly, "that was unexpected." Colt stared at him, at the man he'd come to kill. The man who'd just saved his life without hesitation, without question, without apparent concern for the fact that 30 seconds ago Colt had been one trigger pull away from ending him. "Why?" Colt asked. His voice came out hoarse. "Why what?" "Why help me? I was about to... I had a gun on you." "Past tense," Elias interrupted. "Had. But right now you've got bigger problems than me. We both do." He gestured with his revolver toward the groaning outlaws. "These boys aren't alone. Men like this, they travel in packs. There'll be more outside, probably waiting to see if their friends finished what they started." As if summoned by the words, gunfire erupted from the street, not aimed at the saloon, just noise. Warning shots, or celebration, or the general chaos that erupted when violent men decided to make a statement. McGreevy poked his head up from behind the bar. "They're tearing up the town! Someone needs to..." He looked at Elias, then at Colt, then back again. "Marshal?" "I'm not a marshal anymore," Elias said. "Could have fooled me." The barkeep jerked his thumb toward the door. "The town council's been trying to hire someone for 3 months. No takers. Everyone's too scared of exactly this kind of thing." More shots from outside. Closer now. The sound of breaking glass, a window somewhere shattering under impact or intent. Elias moved to the window, keeping low, peering out through a gap in the curtains. His expression darkened. 8 more, maybe 10. Horses tied up outside the general store. They're liquored up and mean. "Fantastic," Colt muttered. He checked his revolver. 3 rounds left. 3 rounds against 10 men. The math didn't look promising. "How many you got?" Elias asked without turning around. 3. "I've got 4. Elias glanced back at him. Not exactly overwhelming odds. "No." Colt hesitated, then said what he was thinking before caution could stop him. "Why are you still here? You could have run when they came through that door. Could have let them handle me, saved yourself the trouble." Elias finally turned away from the window. His faded eyes studied Colt with an intensity that made the younger man want to look away, but somehow couldn't. "Because I told you the truth about your brother," Elias said simply. "And because you didn't shoot me when you had the chance. That means something. Maybe you're not the man you thought you were. Maybe you're better. Or maybe you're just confused and exhausted and finally willing to listen to something besides your own hurt. Either way, I'm not about to let you die in a saloon in Redemption Hollow because some damn fool outlaws decided today was a good day to settle old scores. That's not an answer." Elias allowed a grim smile. "Maybe not. But it's what I've got. Now, are you going to stand there psychoanalyzing my motivations? Or are you going to help me keep these people alive?" Colt looked around the saloon. At McGreevy crouched behind his bar. At Morris still under the piano, eyes wide with fear. At the card players pressed against walls or behind overturned tables. Ordinary men living ordinary lives who'd woken up this morning with no expectation that they'd be caught in a gunfight before sunset. And he thought about Daniel, about the choices his brother had made, about Thomas Whitaker, the clerk who'd died on bank steps because he'd been in the wrong place when desperate men made desperate decisions, about cycles of violence and grief that fed on themselves, growing larger with each iteration until they consumed everything in reach. He could walk out right now. Let Elias handle this alone. Let Redemption Hollow burn or survive on its own merits. He didn't know these people anything. He'd come here for one purpose, and that purpose was lying on the floor in a spreading pool of questions and doubt. But then he remembered Elias's words. You find something worth living for instead of just someone worth dying to kill. Maybe this was it. Maybe this was the moment where he became someone different, someone better. Or maybe he was just too tired to keep running and needed something concrete to fight against that wasn't wrapped up in his own confusion. Either way, the choice was made before he fully realized he was making it. All right, Colt said. He moved to the window opposite Elias, checked the street through a crack in the wall. What's the plan? Elias looked at him for a long moment. Something shifted in his expression. Not quite approval, not quite relief, but something in that territory. The plan, the old lawman said, is we don't let them burn this town. Beyond that, we make it up as we go. Sounds terrible. Most plans are. Elias chambered around. But we work with what we've got. Outside, the shouting grew louder, more glass breaking. A woman screaming, the particular brand of chaos that happened when violent men realized there was no one to stop them from being exactly as violent as they wanted to be. Colt's hand tightened on the peacemaker. 3 rounds. Maybe 4 if he could scavenge from one of the downed outlaws. Against 10 men who had no reason to show mercy and every reason to paint the street red. The math still didn't look good. But standing next to Elias Boone, looking out at the street where his brother had died 4 years ago. Not here, but in a town just like this one. In a moment just like this one. Colt felt something shift inside him. Not resolution. Not peace. Just the faint possibility that maybe there was another way to live, besides the one he'd carved out of hate and grief. Hey, Mercer, Elias said quietly. Yeah? If we survive this, we should probably have a longer conversation about what happens next. If we survive this, Colt replied, I'll buy the first round. Elias almost smiled. Deal! Then the door burst open again, and the shooting started in earnest. And there was no more time for words or choices or anything except the brutal mathematics of survival in a world that didn't care who deserved to live and who deserved to die. But Colt Mercer faced it standing beside the man he'd come to kill. And somehow that felt like the first honest thing he'd done in 4 years. The gun lowered, not dropped, not holstered, just lowered, barrel pointing at the floor instead of at Elias Boone's chest. Colt's arm felt like it weighed 100 pounds, like the muscles had forgotten their purpose, like gravity had finally won a fight it had been losing for 4 years. The saloon didn't explode into noise. Nobody cheered or gasped or started breathing again like this was some kind of show with a happy ending. The silence just shifted quality, from the held-breath terror of imminent violence to something else, something that felt like collective confusion mixed with relief nobody wanted to admit to feeling. Colt stood there, gun hanging loose in his hand, staring at the old lawman who'd just dismantled everything he'd built his life around with nothing but words and truth. Or maybe lies. The hell of it was he still couldn't be certain, and that uncertainty felt worse than any bullet wound. Felt like bleeding from the inside where nobody could see it or stitch it up. What now? Colt's voice came out rough, scraped raw. You expect me to just walk away? Pretend the last 4 years didn't happen? Elias didn't move from his chair. I don't expect anything, but I'd suggest you figure out what comes next before you make another choice you can't take back. Don't lecture me. Not lecturing, just stating fact. The old man's weathered face showed something that might have been sympathy if Colt had been in any state to recognize it. You came here for vengeance. Vengeance is gone now, or at least complicated enough that pulling that trigger wouldn't feel like justice anymore. So you're standing in a saloon in a town you don't know, with a gun in your hand and no plan past this moment. That's a dangerous place to be. Colt finally holstered the peacemaker. The leather accepted it like an old friend coming home, familiar and wrong at the same time. His hand felt empty without the weight, felt useless. "I should kill you anyway," he said. But there was no heat behind it, just the exhausted recognition that maybe he should, but probably wouldn't and definitely couldn't without destroying whatever was left of himself that still resembled something human. "You could try." Elias's tone remained level. "I'm old, not helpless, and I've got friends in this town who wouldn't take kindly to watching me get shot without cause." Without cause? The anger flared up again, brief and hot. "I've got 4 years of cause. You've got 4 years of grief. That's not the same thing." Elias reached for his coffee cup, took a slow sip even though the liquid had to be cold enough to curdle. Grief makes people do things they wouldn't otherwise do, makes them into versions of themselves they don't recognize come morning, but it doesn't change facts. Your brother made choices. I made choices. Both of us had to live with the consequences, or, in Daniel's case, die with them. Stop saying his name like you knew him. I did know him. Not well, but I knew him. He talked while he was dying. Elias set the cup down carefully. "Ask me to tell you he was sorry. Ask me to tell your mother he loved her. I wrote it all down in my report, but I don't imagine you ever saw that." The words hit like physical blows. Colt's vision swam, his throat constricted. "You're lying. Why? What purpose does it serve?" The old lawman's eyes held steady, and there was a sadness in them that felt genuine, felt earned. "You think I enjoyed watching a 22-year-old kid bleed out in the dirt? You think I went home that night feeling good about myself? I did what my job required. Doesn't mean I didn't carry it." Before Colt could respond, before he could figure out what response even made sense anymore, the saloon door burst open again. This time it wasn't dramatic entrance or violent intention, just a kid of maybe 16, skinny as a fence post and moving like his boots were on fire. "Marshall Boone!" The kid's voice cracked on the title, nervous energy making him bounce on his toes. "We got trouble. Big trouble." Every head in the saloon turned. Elias stood up slowly, joints protesting, one hand braced on the table. "I'm not marshal of anything anymore, Tommy. You know that." "Yeah, but Sheriff Crawford's out of town until tomorrow and Deputy Perkins is drunk as a skunk down at the boarding house and there's—" The kid noticed Colt for the first time, noticed the gun, noticed the atmosphere that still hung thick as smoke. "Am I interrupting something?" "No," Elias said at the same time Colt said, "Yes." The old lawman ignored Colt's response. "What's the trouble?" "Cattle thieves. The Garner gang." Tommy's words tumbled out fast and breathless. "They hit the Rocking W ranch about an hour ago, took maybe 50 head, shot up the bunkhouse, pistol-whipped old man Wallace when he tried to stop them. Now they're camped out by Copper Creek, getting drunk and mean. Mrs. Wallace sent her boy to get help. Said they're talking about coming into town tonight for supplies and entertainment, if you know what I mean." A murmur ran through the saloon. Men shifted in their seats, hands moving toward guns, faces hardening. The Garner gang had a reputation, nasty sons of bitches who took what they wanted and burned what they didn't. 5 men led by a bastard named Virgil Garner, who'd killed at least 3 people that anyone could prove, and probably twice that many in situations where the bodies never got found. "How many?" Elias asked. 5 of them, all armed, all mean. Against a town with no sheriff and a drunk deputy. Elias's jaw tightened. "That's a problem. That's why I came to you. Folks say you might be retired, but you're not dead, and right now we need somebody who knows what they're doing before those boys come riding in here looking for trouble." Colt watched this exchange with detached interest, like observing something happening in a different room to different people. Part of him wanted to just walk out, get on his horse, ride away from Redemption Hollow and everything in it. The other part, the part that had kept him going through 4 years of hunting and hating, wouldn't let him move. Elias looked around the saloon, taking measure of what he had to work with. A dozen men, most of them more comfortable holding cards than guns. A few ranch hands who could probably shoot straight if pressed, but who'd never faced down armed outlaws with murder in their eyes. No real law, no real defense. "I'll need volunteers," Elias said. "Men who can ride and shoot and won't run when things get ugly." Silence. The kind that speaks louder than words. The kind that says, everybody in this room has families and futures they'd like to keep intact. Thank you very much. McGreevy spoke up from behind the bar. "We'll pay you. The town council's got funds for emergencies." "I don't want your money." Elias's voice carried an edge now. The authority of a man who'd spent decades making people listen whether they wanted to or not. I want citizens willing to defend their town. The Garners aren't going to negotiate. They're not going to take a warning and leave peacefully. They're going to come in here, take what they want, hurt whoever gets in their way, and ride out laughing about it. That acceptable to anyone? More silence. More men finding reasons to study their drinks or their cards or the fascinating patterns in the wood grain of their tables. Hell with this. Colt heard his own voice, distant and strange, like someone else was operating his mouth. I'll go. Every eye swiveled to him. Elias's expression shifted to something between surprise and suspicion. You don't have a stake in this town, the old lawman said. No, but I came here for a fight and didn't get one. Seems wasteful to let all that preparation go to nothing. Colt met Elias's gaze dead on. Besides, I've got no reason to stay and no reason to leave. Might as well do something useful before I figure out what comes next. This isn't a game. You think I don't know that? The anger flared again, but it was different now. Not directed at Elias, just at the world in general, at circumstances and fate, and the way things never worked out the way they were supposed to. I know exactly what this is. 5 armed men against however many idiots are stupid enough to ride out there. Probably ends with somebody dead. Maybe me. Don't particularly care at this point. That's exactly the kind of attitude that gets people killed, Elias said. Men who don't care whether they live or die make mistakes. They take risks that endanger everyone around them. Then don't bring me. Colt's hand rested on his gun butt. Not threatening, just familiar. Stay here with your town full of brave citizens and wait for the Garners to show up. See how that works out for you. The 2 men stared at each other across the space that separated them. Space measured in feet and years and dead brothers and impossible choices. Finally, Elias let out a long breath. You follow my orders, he said. No heroics, no personal vendettas, no going off on your own because you've got a death wish. We do this smart, or we don't do it at all. Fine. I mean it. I said fine. A third voice cut in, surprising everyone. I'll go too. The speaker was a man in his 30s, dark-haired and solid-built, wearing the dust-stained clothes of a working ranch hand. He stood up from a table near the window, setting down his whiskey glass with a definitive clink. Name's Caleb Moss, he said. I work the Rocking W. Was in town buying supplies when this went down. Those are my friends who got shot at, my cows that got stolen. I'm going. Elias nodded slowly. Caleb, good. Anyone else? Another man rose, younger than Caleb but older than Tommy. Frank Peters. I can shoot. How well? Well enough. That's not an answer. Frank met the old lawman's skeptical gaze without flinching. I was a corporal in the war, fought at Wilson's Creek. I know which end of a rifle points where, and I don't freeze up when people shoot back. That answer your question? It does. Elias looked around the room again. One more. I want 4 of us. Even odds are better than I expected at this point. The saloon remained quiet. Nobody else seemed inclined toward suicide by cattle rustler. Then McGreevy emerged from behind his bar, carrying a double-barreled shotgun that looked like it had seen better decades. I'll go. You're a barkeep. I'm also a taxpayer and a citizen, and those boys are threatening my livelihood. McGreevy's doughy face had gone hard, determined. Plus, I've got this. He hefted the shotgun. Don't need to aim precise with this beauty. Just point in the general direction and let the spread do the work. Elias considered this, then nodded. All right. 4 of us plus me makes 5. We're still outnumbered if the count is right, but at least we've got a chance. He turned to Tommy. Where exactly are they camped? North side of Copper Creek, about 3 miles out. There's that old line shack near the cottonwoods. They're using that. I know it. Elias's mind was already working. Colt could see it in his eyes, calculating angles, approaches, timing. The lawman might be retired, but he hadn't forgotten how to think tactically. We've got maybe 2 hours before sunset. That gives us time to ride out, get in position, wait for dark. Why wait? Colt asked. We've got daylight now. Use it. Because 5 drunk men in daylight are just 5 men. 5 drunk men at night with a fire blinding them and darkness at our backs. That's an advantage. Elias looked at each of them in turn. We're not going out there to get killed. We're going out there to end this with minimal bloodshed on our side and maximum effectiveness on theirs. Anyone have a problem with that approach? Nobody did. Good. Get whatever weapons and ammunition you've got. Meet at the livery in 15 minutes. Wear dark clothes if you have them. Bring canteens. This might take a while. The men dispersed to gather their gear. Colt stayed where he was, watching Elias, trying to reconcile this version of the old lawman, decisive, commanding, capable, with the man he'd spent 4 years imagining as a coward and a murderer. "Why are you doing this?" Colt asked when they were alone. "You said yourself you're not marshal anymore. This isn't your responsibility." Elias looked at him with those tired, honest eyes. "No, but I lived in this town for 8 years before I retired. These are people I know, people I shared meals with, traded stories with, watched grow up and grow old. Walking away while they're in danger isn't something I can do, badge or no badge. Even knowing you might die? Especially knowing that." The old lawman moved toward the door, footsteps steady despite the years. "I've already lived longer than I probably deserved. Might as well spend whatever time's left doing something that matters." "You think stopping cattle thieves matters?" "I think stopping bad men from hurting good people always matters." Elias paused at the entrance, turned back. "You coming or just asking questions?" Colt followed without answering. The ride to Copper Creek took 90 minutes at a careful pace. 5 men on horseback moving through terrain that shifted from scrubgrass to rocky slopes to the kind of wooded creek bottom where ambushes were born. The sun hung low and orange, painting everything in shades of amber and rust, beautiful in the way that dying things sometimes are. Nobody talked much. Caleb rode point with Elias, the two of them trading hand signals occasionally, communicating in the shorthand of men who'd done this kind of thing before. Frank brought up the rear, rifle across his saddle, eyes constantly scanning. McGreevy looked nervous but determined, his shotgun cradled like a baby he was afraid of dropping. Colt rode in the middle, his peacemaker loaded and ready, his mind caught between past and present, between who he'd been 2 hours ago and who he might be becoming. The certainty that had driven him for 4 years had evaporated like morning dew, leaving behind nothing but questions and the kind of emptiness that comes from losing your purpose without finding a replacement. He'd come to Redemption Hollow to kill a man. Now he was riding beside that same man to fight strangers who'd done him no harm, for a town he didn't know, for people he'd never met. None of it made sense. All of it felt inevitable, like he'd been heading toward this moment since the day Daniel died, since the day his life became about revenge instead of living. They smelled the Garner camp before they saw it, wood smoke and cooking meat and the sour reek of men who'd been drinking hard. Elias raised a hand and the group halted, still concealed by a rise covered in scrub oak and juniper. "Dismount," the old lawman whispered. "Tie the horses here, we go the rest on foot." They secured their mounts and moved forward in a crouch, keeping low, using the terrain for cover. The creek burbled 50 yards to their left, providing a constant backdrop of white noise that would mask small sounds. The sun had dropped below the horizon now, leaving that brief twilight period where visibility went unreliable and shadows turned deceptive. The line shack came into view through the trees, a ramshackle structure built decades ago by ranchers who needed shelter during roundups. One wall had partially collapsed. The roof sagged dangerous, but it was still standing. Barely. A fire burned in a ring of stones outside the shack, flames jumping high, fed too much wood by men who weren't worried about being seen. Figures moved around the fire, 5 of them just like Tommy had said. They'd tethered the stolen cattle in a makeshift corral nearby, the animals lowing nervously, sensing danger the way animals do. "That's them," Caleb breathed, hatred thick in his voice. "That's Virgil Garner, the one with the black vest." Colt studied the man in question. Tall, rangy, with a face that looked like it had been assembled from spare parts, mismatched features that somehow combined into something mean and predatory. He wore 2 guns, fancy rigs with carved leather, the kind of weapons a man bought when he had money and wanted everyone to know it. The other 4 were cut from similar cloth, hard cases with empty eyes, and the kind of casual cruelty that comes from years of taking what they wanted and hurting anyone who objected. They were passing around a bottle, laughing about something, completely unaware they were being watched. "All right." Elias kept his voice barely above a whisper. "Here's how we do this. Caleb, you take the west side. Use those rocks for cover. Frank, east side, behind that fallen tree. McGreevy, stay here with the horses in case this goes sideways and we need to run. Mercer, he paused, looking at Colt. You're with me. We're going straight in. Get as close as we can before we announce ourselves. Why me? Colt asked. Because if anyone's going to make a mistake and start shooting early, I'd rather have you where I can see you. Elias's tone allowed no argument. Also because you're the best shot here besides me, and I need someone I can count on if this gets messy. You don't know if I'm a good shot? Yes, I do. I saw the way you drew on me in the saloon. Smooth, fast, controlled. You've practiced. A lot. Men who practice that much usually know how to hit what they aim at. They moved into position, each man finding his spot, settling in. The wait felt eternal, seconds stretching into hours, hearts beating too loud, breath coming too fast. The outlaws kept drinking, kept laughing, completely oblivious to the trap closing around them. Elias checked his gun one final time, then looked at Colt. When we step out there, I do the talking. They might surrender peacefully. You don't believe that? No, but I have to try anyway. The old lawman's face was grim in the failing light. Killing should always be a last resort, not a first option. Remember that. Before Colt could respond, Elias stood up and walked forward into the firelight, hands raised, palms out. His voice rang clear and strong across the camp. Virgil Garner, you and your men are under arrest for cattle theft and assault. Throw down your weapons and surrender peacefully. The laughter stopped. 5 heads turned as one, 5 pairs of eyes reflecting firelight and malice. For a frozen moment, nobody moved, nobody breathed, the world balanced on the edge of violence or sense. Then Virgil smiled, and it was the kind of smile that meant someone was about to die. Well now, he drawled, voice thick with whiskey and contempt. If it isn't the old law dog himself. Heard you retired, Boone. Heard you were too broken down to wear a badge anymore. I am retired. This isn't official business. Just one citizen asking another to do the right thing. The right thing. Virgil spat into the fire. And what if we're not inclined toward right things? Then we have a problem. We? Virgil's eyes scanned the darkness beyond the fire. That a royal we, old man? Or you got friends hiding out there? I've got enough. Elias's voice remained steady. Enough to make this end badly for all of us if you choose that path. Or you can surrender, face trial like civilized men, take your punishment. Either way, you're not keeping those cattle and you're not riding into Redemption Hollow tonight. Virgil glanced at his companions. Something passed between them, some unspoken communication that Colt recognized from his own violent past. They'd made their decision before Elias even finished talking. Here's what I think, old-timer. Virgil's hand moved toward his gun, slow and deliberate. I think you're bluffing. I think you're out here alone or maybe with one other fool trying to scare us off with tough talk. And I think you should listen to the marshal, Colt said, stepping out of the shadows on Elias's right, his peacemaker drawn and level. He's trying to save your life. The arrival of a second man shifted the mathematics, but not enough. Virgil's grin widened. 2 against 5. I'll take those odds. Make it 4 against 5. Frank emerged from behind the fallen tree, rifle aimed steady. A second later, Caleb stepped out from the rocks, his own Winchester trained on the outlaws. Now the math looked different. Now uncertainty flickered across Virgil's face, calculation replacing confidence. Last chance, Elias said. Guns down, hands up. Nobody has to die tonight. For a heartbeat, Colt thought they might actually do it. Thought common sense might prevail over pride and stupidity. But then one of the younger outlaws, a kid no older than 20 with acne scars and terrified eyes, panicked and reached for his weapon. Everything exploded into noise and gunfire and chaos. The young outlaw's first shot went wild, nowhere near any of them. Colt's response didn't. He aimed low, going for the leg instead of center mass, and saw the kid spin and drop, screaming, gun falling from his hand. Virgil and his men scattered, some diving for cover behind the shack, others running for their horses. Muzzle flashes lit up the darkness like lightning. Bullets whined and cracked through the air. The cattle panicked, bellowing and surging against their makeshift fence. Colt moved on instinct, the kind of muscle memory that comes from being in situations like this too many times before. He fired twice more, one shot splintering wood next to an outlaw's head, the other taking a gun out of someone's hand in a spray of blood and curses. Elias advanced toward the shack, old legs moving with surprising speed, his own gun barking methodically. He wasn't aiming to kill either, Colt noticed, shooting to disable, to frighten, to control rather than to murder. Frank's rifle cracked from the flank, and one of the outlaws went down clutching his shoulder. Caleb worked the lever on his Winchester, laying down cover fire that forced two more men to abandon their position behind a water trough. Then McGreevy's shotgun roared from somewhere behind them, both barrels unloading in a thunderous blast that turned a section of the shack wall into splinters and dust. The boom echoed across the creek bottom like the end of the world. Silence fell hard and sudden. Ringing ears, smoke, the smell of gunpowder thick enough to taste. 3 of the outlaws were down, wounded but alive. A 4th had his hands up, eyes wide, clearly done fighting. Only Virgil remained standing, backed against the collapsed wall of the line shack, gun in hand but pointed at the ground. "It's over," Elias said, his breathing heavy but controlled. "Drop it." Virgil looked at his fallen companions, looked at the 4 armed men surrounding him, looked at the situation that had gone from certain victory to complete disaster in under 30 seconds. His face worked through emotions, rage, fear, calculation, resignation. The gun fell from his fingers. "Smart choice," Elias said. They bound the outlaws with rope from the saddlebags, tended the wounded well enough to keep them from bleeding out, and secured them for transport. The whole operation took maybe 20 minutes, but it felt like hours. Adrenaline stretching time like taffy. Colt stood apart from the others, his gun finally holstered, hands shaking slightly from the aftermath. He'd fired 3 shots, hit what he aimed at all 3 times. Could have killed all 3 men easily, but hadn't. Had chosen restraint instead of murder, had chosen control instead of chaos. When had he started making choices like that? Elias walked over, moving careful, favoring his left side slightly. "You all right?" "I'm fine." "You did good back there. Controlled, professional." Colt didn't respond. He was staring at the young outlaw he'd shot in the leg, watching Caleb wrap the wound with strips torn from a shirt. The kid couldn't be much older than Daniel had been. Same lean build, same desperate eyes, different circumstances, different choices, but ultimately just another young man who'd picked the wrong path and paid the price. "I could have killed him," Colt said quietly. "When he drew. I had a clear shot, center mass. Would have ended it instantly. But you didn't." "No." "Why not?" The question hung in the night air. Colt didn't have a good answer, or maybe he had too many answers and couldn't sort through them all. "Because he reminded me of someone," he finally said. "Someone who made a mistake and didn't deserve to die for it." Elias was quiet for a long moment. When he spoke, his voice carried something that sounded almost like pride. That's the difference between a killer and a man who sometimes has to kill. One sees people as targets. The other sees them as people who've made bad choices. First kind sleeps easy. Second kind carries weight. But the second kind builds something worth keeping. What if I don't want to carry weight? Too late. You're already carrying it. The old lawman gestured at the captured outlaws, at the stolen cattle, at the scene of controlled violence that could have been a massacre, but wasn't. "Question is what you do with it." Before Colt could respond, McGreevy called out, "We ready to move? Don't want to be out here when more of their friends show up." "There aren't any more," Virgil growled from where he sat bound against a tree. "It was just us 5. "Your word means nothing," Caleb spat. "It's the truth." The outlaw leader looked diminished now, reduced from predator to prisoner. "We split from a bigger gang 2 weeks ago. Just us 5 going freelance, nobody's coming." Elias studied him, reading truth or lies in the set of his shoulders, the tone of his voice. "I believe him, but we should still move." They loaded the prisoners onto horses, started the long ride back to Redemption Hollow. The stolen cattle would have to wait until morning, when they could bring proper hands to drive them back to the Rocking W. For now, getting the outlaws to a cell was priority. The moon had risen full and bright by the time they reached town, turning the landscape silver and strange. Lights burned in windows despite the late hour. Word of the confrontation had spread, and people waited anxiously for news. A small crowd gathered as they rode down Main Street, 5 armed men bringing in 5 bound prisoners. Faces appeared in doorways. Children peeked from behind their mothers' skirts. The night watchman emerged from the sheriff's office, looking confused and relieved at the same time. They locked the Garner gang in the town's 3 cells, cramming multiple prisoners together, posting McGreevy as guard until Sheriff Crawford returned in the morning. The wounded were treated by Doc Henderson, a 70-year-old physician who'd seen worse and would probably see worse again before his time ran out. Finally, as midnight approached, Colt found himself standing outside the saloon with Elias. The street had emptied. The excitement faded, leaving just the 2 of them and the weight of everything that had happened in a single impossible day. "You planning to stay?" Elias asked. Colt looked up at the stars, bright and indifferent, the same stars that had watched Daniel die 4 years ago, the same stars that would keep watching long after everyone currently alive had joined him. "I don't know. Haven't thought that far ahead. Town could use someone like you, not as law necessarily, just as someone who knows how to handle himself when things get difficult." "You offering me a job?" "I'm offering you a chance to figure out who you are when you're not chasing ghosts." Elias turned to face him fully. "You rode out there tonight, and you could have killed 3 men, but you didn't. You chose differently. That means something. Means I'm getting soft. Means you're getting human." The old lawman smiled, tired but genuine. "There's a difference between being soft and having a conscience. One makes you weak. The other makes you someone worth knowing." Colt wanted to argue, wanted to reject the idea that anything about tonight mattered or meant anything beyond coincidence and circumstances. But he was tired, and the words wouldn't come, and maybe part of him didn't want them to come anyway. "I'm not staying," he said finally. "But I'm not leaving tonight either." "Fair enough." Elias extended his hand. "For whatever it's worth, I'm sorry about your brother, and I'm glad you didn't kill me." Colt looked at the offered hand for a long moment, then took it. The grip was firm despite the years, weathered skin, and calloused palms, the handshake of a man who'd worked hard and lived harder. "I'm not glad," Colt said. "Not yet, but maybe I will be. Eventually. That's a start." They parted ways there, Elias heading to whatever room he rented somewhere in town, Colt walking toward the boarding house where he'd stabled his horse earlier that day. The street lay quiet and empty, just the sound of his boots and the distant bark of a dog and the rustle of wind through cottonwood leaves. Tomorrow would bring questions and complications. Sheriff Crawford would want statements. The town would want answers. Colt would have to decide whether to ride on or stay a while longer, whether to keep searching for purpose or try building something new from the wreckage of the old. But tonight, for just this moment, walking through a town that wasn't his toward a bed that wasn't home, Colt Mercer felt something he hadn't felt in 4 years. He felt like maybe, possibly, against all odds and expectations, he might actually survive becoming whoever he was supposed to be next. The gun at his hip felt lighter somehow. Or maybe he just felt stronger. Hard to tell the difference in the dark. Sleep didn't come easy that night. Colt lay on a narrow bed in Mrs. Hendrick's boarding house, staring at ceiling boards that needed paint, listening to the building settle and creak around him like an old man's joints. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw Daniel's face, not as it had been in death, which he'd never actually witnessed, but as he remembered it from childhood. That crooked grin, those eyes that always seemed to be planning something. The way his brother used to ruffle Colt's hair and call him Little Gun, because even at 8 years old, Colt could shoot straighter than most grown men. The memories hurt different now, less like open wounds and more like old scars that ached when the weather changed. He'd spent 4 years building Daniel into a martyr, a perfect victim whose death demanded perfect vengeance. But Elias's words had cracked that foundation, let doubt seep in like water through stone. And now Colt couldn't stop wondering if he'd ever really known his brother at all, or if grief had just painted over the truth with prettier colors. Around 3 in the morning, he gave up on sleep, pulled on his boots and coat, and walked out into the street. The town lay silent under that big western sky, stars so thick they looked like spilled salt. His breath misted in the cold air. Somewhere a horse nickered softly in its stall. He found himself walking toward the sheriff's office without consciously choosing the direction. Light showed through the window. McGreevy still on guard duty, probably half asleep in a chair, but Colt didn't go inside. He sat down on the steps outside, rested his elbows on his knees, and just existed for a while without purpose or plan. That's where Elias found him 20 minutes later, the old lawman emerging from the darkness like he'd been summoned by thought alone. "Can't sleep either?" Elias asked. "Something like that." The old man lowered himself onto the steps with a grunt, joints protesting the movement. For a while, neither of them spoke, just sat there like two statues watching the empty street. "I meant what I said earlier," Elias finally offered, "about you being welcome to stay." "I heard you the first time. Just making sure it registered." Elias pulled out a dented tin of tobacco, rolled himself a cigarette with practiced fingers. "You strike me as the type who hears things but doesn't always listen." "That's supposed to be wisdom?" "Just observation." He lit the cigarette with a match struck against the step, took a deep drag. "I was like you once, young, angry, convinced the world owed me something. Spent my 20s settling scores that didn't need settling, proving points that didn't need proving. Made a lot of mistakes before I figured out that carrying weight doesn't make you strong. Learning when to put it down does." Colt watched the smoke curl up into the darkness. "How'd you figure that out?" "Got shot, nearly died. Spent 3 weeks in bed realizing that all the men I'd killed, all the fights I'd won, none of it would matter if I bled out alone in some town where nobody knew my name." Elias tapped ash onto the ground. "Changed my perspective some." "So you became a lawman?" "Eventually. First I became a drunk, then a drifter. Took a few years to land on something that felt like purpose instead of just distraction." He glanced sideways at Colt. "Point is, there's no straight line from broken to whole. You just keep moving and hope you end up somewhere better than where you started." "Profound," Colt said, "but there wasn't much bite to it." "Mock all you want. Doesn't make it less true." Elias took another drag. "Tomorrow Sheriff Crawford gets back. He's going to have questions about what happened out at Copper Creek, about why a stranger rode into his town and started playing deputy without being asked. I didn't play anything. You needed help. I helped. I know that. You know that. But Crawford's been sheriff here for 15 years, and he gets territorial about jurisdiction, just giving you fair warning that things might get complicated." Colt shrugged. "Let them get complicated. I can handle complicated." "Can you handle staying? Because that's what I'm really asking." Elias stubbed out the cigarette against the step. "This town needs someone like you. Someone who's seen enough violence to recognize it coming but hasn't gone so numb they don't care anymore. You showed restraint last night, control. That's rare." "I'm not a lawman. Didn't say you had to be, but there's other ways to help. Ways that don't involve a badge but still matter." The old man stood up slowly, bones creaking. "Think about it. That's all I'm asking. Don't run just because running's what you know how to do." He disappeared back into the darkness, leaving Colt alone with the stars and his thoughts, and the weight of choices he hadn't asked for but couldn't seem to avoid. Dawn came pale and cold, painting the eastern sky in shades of gray and pink. Colt had made it back to his room eventually, managed maybe an hour of restless sleep before giving up entirely. He washed his face in the basin, checked his gun out of habit, and headed downstairs to the boarding house dining room where Mrs. Hendricks served breakfast to whoever was staying. 3 other guests occupied the long table, traveling merchants by the look of them. Soft hands and clean clothes, talking about prices and routes and profit margins. They fell silent when Colt entered, probably recognizing him from last night's procession through town. Word traveled fast in small places. He ate quickly, not tasting the eggs or biscuits, just fueling the machine. Mrs. Hendricks, a plump woman in her 50s with kind eyes and iron-gray hair, refilled his coffee without being asked. "Heard what you did," she said quietly. "My husband died stopping thieves 10 years back. Took a bullet protecting his store. So I appreciate men willing to stand up when standing up needs doing." Colt didn't know what to say to that, so he just nodded and kept eating. He was finishing his second cup of coffee when the door banged open and Tommy, the skinny kid from yesterday, burst in looking panicked. "Mr. Mercer, you gotta come quick." "What's wrong?" "It's one of the prisoners, the young one you shot. He's gone bad. Doc says he's burning up with fever, says the wound's infected and he needs surgery, but the kid's thrashing around, won't let nobody touch him. Sheriff Crawford wants you there." "Why me?" "Don't know. Just said get you now." Colt threw coins on the table and followed Tommy out into the morning light. They half ran to the doctor's office, a small building next to the general store. Inside smelled like carbolic and blood, and the particular stench of infection that any man who'd lived through the war recognized instantly. The young outlaw lay on a table, skin pale and slick with sweat, leg wrapped in bandages already soaked through with yellow-green discharge. His eyes were wild, unfocused. Doc Henderson stood nearby looking frustrated and tired. Sheriff Crawford, a thick-built man with a gray mustache and suspicious eyes, stood in the corner with arms crossed. "You Mercer?" Crawford asked. "I am." "You're the one shot him." "I am," Colt repeated, meeting the sheriff's gaze without flinching. "He's asking for you. Keeps saying your name. Only thing he said that makes any sense since the fever took hold." Crawford gestured at the table. "Doc needs to operate, get that bullet out and clean the wound, but the boy won't hold still. Keeps fighting. We try to hold him down, he just fights harder. Thought maybe if you talk to him, he might listen." Colt approached the table slowly. The kid's eyes found him, struggled to focus. Recognition flickered. "You," the outlaw rasped. "You shot me." "I did. Could have killed me. Should have." His breath came in short gasps. "Why didn't you?" "Because you were scared. Because killing you wouldn't have solved anything." Colt pulled up a chair, sat down so he was eye level with the kid. "What's your name?" Billy Marsh." "How old are you, Billy?" 19, 20 next month, maybe." He coughed, grimaced in pain. "If I make it." "Doc says you need surgery. Says the wound's infected and it'll kill you if he doesn't operate." "I know." Fear cracked through the fever haze in Billy's eyes. "But I seen surgery before. Seen men screaming. Seen them die on the table. Don't want that. Rather just go quiet." Doc Henderson spoke up from across the room. "I've done this procedure dozens of times. You'll survive if you let me work." "Or I'll die screaming." "Maybe," the doc admitted, "but probably not. Probably you'll hurt like hell for a few days and then start healing. But I need you to stay still. Can't work if you're thrashing." Billy's eyes went back to Colt. "Will you stay while he does it?" "Why would you want me here? I'm the one who put that bullet in you." "Yeah, but you could have put it in my head and you didn't. That means something." The kid's hand reached out, trembling, and Colt found himself taking it without thinking. "I'm scared. Don't want to be alone." Something shifted in Colt's chest. Some piece that had been locked tight for 4 years suddenly loosening. This kid, this stupid, scared kid who'd made terrible choices and wound up on a doctor's table in a town he didn't know, wasn't so different from Daniel. Wasn't so different from Colt himself at 19, full of pride and certainty and the kind of fearlessness that comes from not understanding consequences. "All right," Colt said. "I'll stay." The surgery took 90 minutes. Billy screamed through most of it despite the whiskey they poured into him, despite the leather strap they gave him to bite down on. Doc Henderson worked with steady hands, cutting away infected tissue, extracting the bullet that had flattened against bone, cleaning the wound with alcohol that made Billy nearly pass out from the pain. Colt held the kid's hand the entire time. Didn't let go even when Billy's grip got so tight it felt like bones might break. Just sat there and took it, accepting this small piece of suffering as some kind of penance for wounds he'd inflicted or failed to prevent over the years. When it was finally over, Billy lay unconscious on the table, breathing shallow but steady. Doc Henderson washed his hands in a basin, looking exhausted but satisfied. "He'll live," the doc said, "assuming infection doesn't set back in. But I think we got it all." He nodded at Colt. "Good thing you stayed. Helped keep him calm, relatively speaking." Sheriff Crawford had watched the whole procedure from his corner. Now he stepped forward, eyes hard but not hostile. "We need to talk," he said to Colt. "About last night. About what you're doing in my town." They walked to the sheriff's office, leaving Billy in the doc's care. Crawford poured coffee from a pot that looked like it had been sitting since yesterday, offered a cup that Colt declined. The sheriff settled into his chair behind a desk covered in paperwork and warrants and the accumulated debris of small-town law enforcement. "Elias filled me in on most of it," Crawford said. "How you came here hunting him. How things went sideways when the Garner gang showed up. How you helped instead of hindered." He took a sip of the terrible coffee, grimaced. "That about sum it up?" "Close enough." "You planning to finish what you started? With Boone?" The question hung in the air. Colt thought about it honestly, examined his feelings the way you'd examine a wound to see if it was healing or festering. The rage that had sustained him for 4 years felt distant now, like something that had happened to a different person in a different lifetime. "No," he said finally. "I'm not going to kill him." "Just like that? 4 years of hunting and you're done?" "Just like that?" Crawford studied him for a long moment. "Why?" "Because he told me things I needed to hear, things that made me question what I thought I knew. And because I'm tired of carrying hate around like it's something valuable instead of just heavy." Colt met the sheriff's gaze. "My brother made choices. Bad ones. Elias made choices too. Both of them did what they thought was right, and it ended with Daniel dead. Maybe that's justice. Maybe it's just tragedy. Either way, killing Elias won't bring Daniel back or make me feel better or accomplish anything except adding more death to a situation that's already got too much. That's mighty mature of you." "Don't know about mature, just practical." Colt shifted in his chair. "Am I under arrest? For what? Helping stop cattle thieves? Saving the town from getting raided?" Crawford shook his head. "No, you're not under arrest, but I need to know what your intentions are. You staying or moving on?" "Haven't decided." "Well, decide quick. I run a quiet town here. Don't need gunslingers settling in and attracting trouble." "I'm not a gunslinger." "What are you then?" Colt didn't have an answer for that. Didn't know what he was anymore now that vengeance had been taken off the table, now that the only identity he'd built for himself had crumbled like sand. "I'm just a man trying to figure out what comes next," he said. Crawford seemed to accept that. "Fair enough. But while you're figuring, I'd appreciate you not shooting anyone else unless they need shooting. We've got a reputation to maintain." "I'll do my best." The next 3 days passed in a strange kind of limbo. Billy Marsh slowly improved under Doc Henderson's care, the fever breaking on the second day, the wounds starting to show signs of proper healing. The other members of the Garner gang sat in their cells awaiting transport to the territorial prison, sullen and defeated. The stolen cattle were returned to the Rocking W Ranch. Life in Redemption Hollow returned to its normal rhythm of commerce and gossip and the small dramas that occupied people when larger crises weren't pressing. Colt spent most of that time walking, exploring the town and the land around it, trying to get a sense of the place. It wasn't much, maybe 300 people, a single main street, the kind of settlement that could disappear off maps if it wasn't careful. But there was something solid about it, something that felt like it might last if given the chance. He found Elias on the morning of the 4th day, sitting on a bench outside the general store, whittling a piece of wood into something that might eventually become a whistle, or maybe just become kindling. "You're still here," the old lawman observed. "Observant. One of my many talents." Elias examined his work, made another careful cut. "Crawford told me you're not planning to kill me anymore. Appreciated that news. Don't let it go to your head." "Wouldn't dream of it." He set down the knife and wood, gave Colt his full attention. "So what now? You figure out what comes next yet?" Colt sat down on the bench, stretched his legs out in front of him. "Been thinking about what you said, about staying, about finding purpose that isn't just revenge wearing a different hat. And I don't know if I'm built for it. Don't know if I can be the kind of person this town needs. I've spent 4 years being one thing. Becoming something else feels like trying to learn a language I don't have words for." Elias picked up his whittling again, shaved off a thin curl of wood. "Nobody's asking you to become perfect, just asking you to try being better than yesterday. Some days you'll succeed, some days you won't. That's how it works for everyone. You make it sound simple. It is simple. Not easy, but simple. You wake up, you make choices, you live with them, you try again tomorrow." The old man paused, then added, "Besides, you've already started, whether you realize it or not. How do you figure? You stayed with Billy during surgery, held his hand while he screamed. That wasn't revenge talking. That was decency. That was someone who still cares about reducing suffering even when he doesn't have to." Elias glanced at him. "That's the foundation. You build on that." Before Colt could respond, Caleb Moss came jogging up the street, moving with the urgency of a man carrying news. "Elias! Mercer!" He pulled up short, breathing hard. "We got a situation." "What kind?" Elias was already standing, the whistle project abandoned. "Ryder just came in from Pine Bluff. Says there's a range war brewing between the Langford Ranch and the settlers who filed claims on what Langford says is his land. Shots fired yesterday. 1 man wounded. Both sides arming up, and it's going to turn into a bloodbath unless someone stops it. That's 20 miles from here, not our jurisdiction. Pine Bluff doesn't have law, just a town council too scared to get involved. They're asking for help, asking for you specifically. Caleb looked between them. You're the only one in this region with experience handling this kind of thing without it turning into a massacre. Elias's jaw tightened. I'm retired. I know, but those are decent people on both sides. Families. Kids. They're going to kill each other over land and pride unless someone with sense steps in. The old lawman stood there for a long moment, visibly wrestling with the decision. Finally, he looked at Colt. You any good at negotiation? Terrible at it. Perfect. You can stand there looking dangerous while I do the talking. Elias turned back to Caleb. Tell them we'll come, but I need supplies, and I need another man who knows how to shoot and think at the same time. Frank Peters said he'd go if you asked. Good. We leave in an hour. Caleb ran off to spread the word. Elias stood there looking old and tired and resigned to a responsibility he'd tried to escape but couldn't quite shake. You didn't ask if I'd come, Colt said. Didn't need to. You're still here, aren't you? Still trying to figure out what comes next? Well, this is what comes next. A chance to stop violence instead of cause it. A chance to be the kind of man who makes things better instead of just settling scores. The old lawman met his eyes. You in or out? Colt thought about his horse waiting at the livery, thought about the empty road leading away from Redemption Hollow, leading toward anywhere else, toward the comfortable, familiar territory of drifting and not caring and letting the world happen without him. Thought about 4 years of hunting a ghost and the hollowness that had followed when the ghost turned human. I'm in, he said. The ride to Pine Bluff took most of the day. 4 men on horseback crossing terrain that shifted from grassland to rolling hills to the kind of scrub country where disputes over water and grazing rights could turn deadly in the span of a hard season. They didn't talk much, didn't? Frank Peters turned out to be exactly what Elias had described. A veteran who'd seen enough war to hate it, but knew how to function when violence came calling. Caleb rode quiet and serious, checking his rifle every few miles. They reached Pine Bluff just after sunset, a settlement even smaller than Redemption Hollow, maybe 15 buildings clustered around a crossroads like they were trying to convince themselves they mattered. A delegation met them at the edge of town, 3 men from the town council, all nervous and grateful and talking over each other. Elias let them babble for a minute, then raised a hand. One at a time. What's the situation? The eldest of them, a man named Pritchard, with a face like weathered leather, took point. Samuel Langford's been running cattle on this land for 20 years. Claims his father filed on it back in '48. Says he's got legal rights even though the paperwork got lost in a fire. Then 6 months ago, the government opened this territory for homesteading. Settlers came in, filed proper claims, started building. Langford says they're squatting on his land. Settlers say the land was never his to begin with. And yesterday? Yesterday, Langford's men tore down fences the settlers had built. Settlers confronted them. Someone fired a shot. Both sides say it was the other who started it. A man named Cooper took a bullet in the arm. Not fatal, but it escalated things. Now both sides are dug in, armed up, and saying they'll shoot anyone who tries to push them off what they claim is theirs. Elias absorbed this information with the calm of a man who dealt with similar situations before. Where are they now? Langford's at his ranch 5 miles north. Settlers are camped on their claims about 3 miles east. Both groups sent word they'll talk if someone credible mediates. That's why we sent for you. I'm not a judge. Can't settle legal claims. Don't need a judge. Need someone both sides will listen to before they kill each other. The old lawman looked at Colt, at Frank, at Caleb. Thoughts? Talk to them separately first, Frank suggested. Get a sense of what they really want versus what they're saying they want. Find common ground. And if there isn't common ground, Caleb asked, then we make some, Elias said. One way or another. They started with the settlers, riding out to the disputed land where families had staked claims and started building the kind of lives that required faith in the future. 7 homesteads scattered across maybe 200 acres, rough cabins and tents, and the beginnings of fences that had been torn down and rebuilt multiple times. A man in his 40s with sun-weathered skin and farmer's hands stepped forward as they dismounted. "I'm Jacob Hayes, speaking for the settlers here. Elias Boone, these are my associates. We're here to try and find a solution that doesn't end with people dying." Hayes gestured at the makeshift camp behind him. "These folks filed legal claims through the land office. Got papers to prove it. We're not squatters. We're homesteaders trying to make something from nothing, same as anyone else in this territory." "Tell me about the shooting yesterday." "Langford's men came in the morning, started tearing down fences we'd spent weeks building. We confronted them peacefully at first, asked them to stop, showed our claim papers. They laughed, said the papers didn't matter, said Langford owned this land by right of being here first. Then one of them, kid named Dutch, he drew his gun and fired, hit Cooper in the arm. We fired back to defend ourselves. That's what happened." "Langford's people will tell it different," Elias said. "Of course they will. Doesn't make it true." Colt had been quiet, just observing, but now he spoke up. "What do you want here? Best case scenario, if you could have anything?" Hayes didn't hesitate. "We want what we filed for, our land, our chance. We're not trying to take what's Langford's. If he's got legitimate claims on other parcels, fine, but this section was open territory. We followed the law. We deserve to stay. And if Langford won't accept that, then we defend what's ours. We've all got families, kids, futures we're trying to build. We didn't come this far to get pushed off by a rancher who thinks he owns everything he can see." They talked for another 30 minutes, getting details, understanding positions. The settlers weren't unreasonable. They just wanted what they'd been promised, what they'd risked everything to claim. Langford's ranch was a different story. Bigger operation, established, the kind of spread that represented serious money and serious power. The main house sat on a rise overlooking grazing land that stretched to the horizon, hundreds of cattle bearing the Langford brand. Samuel Langford himself came out to meet them, a man in his late 50s with the bearing of someone who'd built an empire from dust and determination. Flanking him were half a dozen ranch hands, all armed, all looking like they knew how to use what they carried. "You Boone?" Langford's voice carried authority, the tone of a man used to being obeyed. "I am." "Heard you were retired." "I am. But Pine Bluff asked for help and I came. That a problem?" Langford studied them for a moment, then gestured toward the house. "Let's talk inside. No point standing in the cold." The ranch house interior spoke to years of success. Good furniture, oil paintings, a massive fireplace. Langford poured whiskey without asking if they wanted any, handed glasses around like this was a social call instead of a negotiation over potential bloodshed. "Those people on my land," Langford started, "they're claiming government gave them rights to property. My family's worked for 2 generations. You understand how that feels? How it feels to have everything you built threatened by strangers waving papers?" "I understand you feel wronged," Elias said. "But did your father actually file legal claim back in 48? "He did. Fire took the land office records in 52, lost everything. But that doesn't erase the claim. Doesn't erase 20 years of sweat and blood making this ranch work. Without documentation, it's hard to prove. I know this land, every acre, every water source, every good grazing area, and every worthless stretch. I've paid taxes on it, defended it from rustlers, made it productive. That's proof enough." Colt leaned forward slightly. "Did you order your men to tear down the settlers' fences?" Langford's eyes shifted to him, assessing. "Who are you?" "Someone interested in facts." "I ordered my men to remove illegal structures from my property." "Yes." "And the shooting?" "Dutch says the settlers fired first. He returned fire in self-defense. Man got hit. I'm sorry about that, truly. But my people have a right to defend themselves same as anyone." Elias set down his untouched whiskey. "Here's the situation as I see it. You've got history and possession. They've got legal claims and determination. Both sides believe they're right. Both sides are willing to fight. Unless we find middle ground, this ends with people dead and the law coming in to sort it out anyway. Except by then it won't matter who is right because you'll all be answering for murder. What do you propose?" "A survey. Bring in a territorial surveyor, have them map everything proper. Determine what land has clear title to you, what land was legitimately opened for homesteading, Split it fair based on law, not on who's been here longer or who's got more guns. Langford's face hardened. And if the survey says I lose land I've worked for 20 years, then you lose it, but you stay alive and out of prison. That's worth something. To you, maybe. To me, it's watching everything I built get carved up and handed to people who just showed up. The room went tense. Hands drifted toward guns. Colt's fingers flexed near his peacemaker, reading the room, calculating angles and threats the way he'd been trained to do. Then Elias stood up slowly, his old bones creaking, and fixed Langford with a look that carried decades of authority and hard-earned wisdom. Mr. Langford, I've seen range wars, seen families destroyed, seen good land turn into graveyards because proud men couldn't bend. You think you're fighting for your legacy? You're fighting to leave your children a legacy of blood and bitterness? Is that what you want? Is that what your father would have wanted? Something flickered in Langford's eyes. Pain, maybe. Recognition. My father died defending this ranch from raiders, he said quietly. Took 3 bullets before he went down. Last thing he told me was to never give up what was ours. And you haven't. But there's a difference between defending what's yours and starting a war over what might not be. Let the surveyors decide. If the land's yours by law, you keep it. If it's not, if those settlers filed proper claims on property that was genuinely available, then you accept it and move forward. Either way, you honor your father's memory by being smart instead of just stubborn. The silence stretched. Langford stared into his whiskey glass like it might hold answers. I'll agree to a survey, he finally said, but if it proves even 1 acre is mine and settlers are on it, they move. No arguments. And if the survey proves their claims are legitimate? Another long pause. Then I suppose I accept it. But I want it done right. Official surveyor, proper documentation, everything legal and binding. Done. Elias extended his hand. You're making the right choice. Langford took it, though his grip was grudging. We'll see. Maybe I'm making the only choice that doesn't end with me hanged or my ranch burned. Not sure that's the same as right. They brokered the same agreement with the settlers that night, got both sides to commit to a temporary ceasefire while the territorial government sent a surveyor. It took 3 more days of negotiations and tense standoffs and moments where it seemed like everything would collapse into violence anyway. But Elias kept talking, kept finding ways to build bridges instead of walls. And somehow, impossibly, it held. The surveyor arrived a week later, spent another week mapping and documenting and comparing old records with new claims. The final determination split the difference more or less. Langford kept the majority of his ranch based on legitimate historical use and some recovered documentation, but the settlers were confirmed on nearly half of what they'd claimed, land that had genuinely been opened for homesteading. Neither side was completely happy, but nobody was dead, and that felt like victory enough. Colt watched all of it unfold with something like wonder. Watched Elias work, watched him negotiate and cajole, and sometimes threaten, but mostly just talk to people like they were human beings capable of reason instead of just animals driven by instinct. It was a kind of skill Colt had never developed, had never thought to develop, because his whole life had been built around simpler solutions. On the ride back to Redemption Hollow, Frank Peters voiced what they were all thinking. Never seen a range war get settled without anyone dying. That's something. It's temporary, Elias said. Give it 6 months, maybe a year, and someone will find a new reason to get angry. But we bought them time. Time to build relationships, time to learn to be neighbors. Sometimes that's all you can do. Colt rode alongside the old lawman in companionable silence for a while, watching the landscape roll past. Finally, he said, "You're good at this." At what? Making people see past their own hate, their own certainty that they're right and everyone else is wrong. Elias smiled, tired but genuine. Spent most of my life doing the opposite, enforcing right and wrong without much room for gray. Took me too long to learn that most situations aren't about good versus evil. They're about people who all think they're good, all think they're justified, all needing someone to help them find a path that doesn't end in tragedy. Is that what you did for me? In the saloon? Tried to. Don't know if it worked. It did. Colt adjusted his hat against the setting sun. I came there to kill you, left there questioning everything I thought I knew. Somewhere in between, something changed. And now? Now I think maybe vengeance is just another word for being too scared to move forward, for holding on to the past so tight you can't see what might come next. He paused, then added, "My brother made choices. Bad ones. You made choices too. Both of you lived with them, or didn't, in Daniel's case. But that's done. That's history. Maybe it's time I started making choices based on what I want to build instead of what I want to destroy." Elias didn't respond right away. When he did, his voice carried a weight of emotion the old lawman usually kept buried. "That's the wisest thing I've heard you say. Don't get used to it." They rode into Redemption Hollow as the sun dipped below the horizon, painting the sky in shades of orange and purple that seemed almost too beautiful for a world as hard as this one. People came out to hear the news, to learn that the crisis had been averted, to thank them for preventing bloodshed. Sheriff Crawford met them at the livery. "Heard you worked a miracle out there." "No miracles," Elias said, dismounting with a grunt. "Just common sense and stubborn refusal to accept that violence was the only option." "Same thing in my book," Crawford turned to Colt. "You sticking around? Or is this where we part ways?" Colt had been dreading this question, this moment of decision. He looked around at the town, small, rough around the edges, not much to speak of in the grand scheme of things. But it had something, a sense of community, maybe. A feeling that people here actually cared about each other instead of just existing side by side. "I'll stay a while," he said. "See how it fits. Town could use a deputy. Pays not much, but it's steady. I'm not a lawman. Neither was I until someone gave me a chance." Crawford's expression softened slightly. "Think about it. No pressure. But the offer stands if you want it." That night, Colt found himself back at McGreevy's saloon, sitting at the same table where he'd confronted Elias what felt like a lifetime ago. The old lawman joined him without being invited, 2 whiskeys appearing as if by magic. "To new beginnings," Elias said, raising his glass. Colt hesitated, then raised his own. "To figuring out what the hell comes next." They drank. The whiskey burned going down, familiar and harsh and somehow comforting. "I visited Billy Marsh today," Colt said. "The kid I shot. Doc says he's healing up good. Might even walk without a limp if he's lucky." "That's good news." "He asked me why I stayed with him during surgery, why I held his hand while he screamed." "What'd you tell him?" "Told him because he reminded me of someone who made mistakes but didn't deserve to die alone and scared." Colt turned the empty glass in his hands. He cried. Said nobody'd ever showed him kindness like that before. Said he'd spent his whole life being treated like he was worthless, so he figured he might as well act like it. What's he going to do now, when he heals? Crawford's giving him a choice. Work off his debt to society here in town, hard labor, community service, that kind of thing, or go to prison with the others. Billy chose to stay. Said maybe it's time he tried being someone different. Elias smiled. Sounds familiar. Yeah. Colt looked up, met the old man's eyes. Guess we're all trying to be someone different. Some of us just started later than others. They sat in comfortable silence for a while. 2 men who'd come within a trigger pull of killing each other, now sharing drinks and the kind of understanding that only comes from walking through fire together and coming out the other side. 3 months later, Colt Mercer wore a deputy's badge and rode patrol through Redemption Hollow like he'd been doing it all his life. It still felt strange sometimes, the weight of authority instead of the weight of vengeance. But strange wasn't the same as wrong. Billy Marsh worked at the livery, mucking stalls and learning honest work. The bullet wound healed to a scar he'd carry forever, but no longer infected or threatening. The kid had filled out some, looked healthier, smiled occasionally, like he was learning how. The Langford situation held steady, the surveyor's ruling accepted if not loved, the settlers and the rancher learning to be neighbors through necessity, if not genuine warmth. And on a quiet afternoon when spring was thinking about becoming summer, Colt stood outside the sheriff's office and realized something that should have been obvious, but somehow wasn't until that exact moment. He was happy. Not perfect. Not healed from everything that had broken him, but happy in the way that matters, occupied with purpose, surrounded by people who'd become something like friends, building instead of destroying. Elias found him there, the old lawman moving slower these days, but still moving, still showing up. Penny for your thoughts, Elias said. just thinking about how different things turned out from how I planned. Better or worse? Colt considered the question honestly. Different, but maybe different is what I needed all along. We usually need what we think we don't want and don't want what we think we need. That's the hell of being human. Profound, Colt said, but he was smiling. They stood together watching the street, watching life happen in its small and unremarkable ways. People buying supplies, kids playing in the dust, horses dozing at hitching posts. Nothing special. Nothing that would make history books or inspire songs. Just life. Plain and ordinary and somehow, against all odds and expectations, enough. The gun at Colt's hip felt lighter these days. Or maybe he just carried it different, carried it as a tool instead of an identity, as something he had instead of something he was. He'd come to Redemption Hollow hunting a ghost and found himself instead. Found that the man he'd been chasing, Elias Boone, killer of his brother, was just a man who'd made impossible choices in impossible circumstances. Found that vengeance was a poor substitute for purpose. Found that sometimes the bravest thing you can do is put down the gun and pick up something else, something harder, something that requires you to be more than just your worst instincts. The sun hung low and golden, painting everything in that particular light that makes even ugly things look beautiful. Somewhere a church bell rang the hour. A dog barked. Life continued its messy, complicated, worth-living march forward. And Colt Mercer, former gunslinger, former revenge seeker, current deputy of a nothing town in the middle of nowhere, felt something he hadn't felt since before Daniel died. Peace. Not the peace of forgetting, not the peace of pretending the past didn't happen, but the peace of carrying your scars without letting them define you, of moving forward without erasing where you came from, of being broken in places but whole enough to keep trying. You know what the best part is? Colt said quietly. What's that? I stopped looking for the end of the story. Started living in the middle instead. Turns out the middle is where all the good stuff happens. Elias nodded, understanding in the way that only someone who'd walked a similar path could understand. Welcome to the rest of your life, son. Make it count. And somewhere, in the fading light of another frontier day, in a town that would never be famous, among people who'd never be legends, Colt Mercer decided he would. The hunt was over. The vengeance was over. The running was over. Whatever came next, he'd face it standing still for once, rooted in something that felt like it might actually last. And that, more than any revenge ever could have, felt like victory.